When someone asks you what you spent your year doing, you might say, oh, I was working, or I was going to school getting my degree, or I got married, or something along those lines. But you know what I'm going to tell people? I spent a year playing and beating every single Souls boss, from Demon Souls to Elden Ring. So that's what today is going to be. We're ranking every single Souls boss ever. So Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. All of these bosses are going to be ranked. Now, I do say every Souls boss, but with a couple exceptions. We're not going to be doing Bloodborne Chalice dungeon bosses and Sekiro side bosses. And for Elden Ring, I'm going to do most of the main bosses and or important ones, but obviously not every single boss in Elden Ring. There's just too many. But this video has been well over a year in the making, so I hope you guys enjoy. Before we get started, just drop a like. That's all I ask, and if you want to subscribe, that would be greatly appreciated. Fromsoftware is practically renowned for having the best boss design of any video game franchise practically ever, and while there are a lot of amazing ones, there are some not so good ones too. Because of how many there are, they're hard to rank side by side, quality speaking, so more or less they're going to be bunched up into different groups of quality, and so I think that's the best way to go about it. With that being said, kids, you know, grab a snack, grab an Estus, and get cozy around the bonfire, because this is going to be a long one. Before we can start with our actual list at the worst boss in Dark Souls, we need to get a few of the anomaly bosses out of the way, and what that means is bosses that don't really fit into any other category other than just their own. So for example, the Old Monk from Demon Souls is a fight that if you're playing online is going to be a PvP fight, and if you're playing offline is a PvE but against a humanoid character. This boss isn't really able to be ranked by the same standards as everything else because your experience is almost entirely determined by the player and build that you happen to play against in this PvP scenario, unless you're talking offline. I think in Demon Souls it's an okay addition. As someone who doesn't really care that much about the PvP stuff in Dark Souls, that's not really why I play Souls games. This fight is not one of my favorites, like it's fine or whatever, but I would never personally go out of my way to do this fight, and if you play against the offline bot of it, it is just absurdly easy, so I can take it or leave it. Not really able to be ranked against everything else, so it's a bit of an anomaly. Next is actually another fight from Demon Souls, which is Maiden Astrea, and this is again an anomaly. It's a bit of a weird one because the actual fight is just Garl Vinland, who is kind of like her protector, and if you manage to kill him, you can simply walk up to the maiden and she will you know, do the job herself. So it's not really a fight. This is more of a story boss, and that's fine. It's just not exactly fair to rank this among everything else. Next is Half-Light Spear of the Church from Dark Souls 3, and I'm not exactly sure what FromSoftware's obsession with these, forced PvP encounters are, and I think this iteration is personally better than the Old Monk in Demon Souls, although not by much. Again, it's entirely dependent on your build and the opponent's build and their skill and all that. There's no consistent experience that you're going to have player to player, which is why it's unrankable. Same deal with Old Monk, however. If you play offline, you play against a bot instead of a sweaty nerd with a Cheeto dust controller, and I can't say I ever agree with forcing PvP into the main campaign of Dark Souls, and this kind of violates that rule for me, so it's not great, but again, it's an anomaly one and not really easy to rank it with everything else. But with those anomalies out of the way, it's time to get into the real list, and I considered putting the first one here in the anomaly list, but then I thought, nah, that, this is going straight in the bad. The Bed of Chaos is taking our list as the worst boss in all of Souls. This is an unpolished, unfinished piece of garbage. To say that this fight is too hard or it's easy is not even a useful way to go, because it's not really a fight at all. This is a platforming segment in which you have to hit a couple of different, critical zones, all while avoiding a sinking platform and stage, and you can even be pushed into things, and it's just not a well-designed fight at all, if you even want to call it that. You can one and done this and be done with it, or it can take you a billion tries. Either way, it's not a satisfying boss to beat. I can understand what they were going for, but again, Dark Souls, in the way that it controls and handles, and especially its emphasis on combat, just works so counterintuitive to this. It's not meant to be a platformer, and Bed of Chaos really shows how clunky the movement can be. I think if this were done in a more modern context, it could be a bit better, especially with a dedicated jump button that Elden Ring has, for example. But in Dark Souls 1 and the very limited moveset and like potential you have with your movement, it's just not good, man. It's easily the worst Souls boss. This boss, I'm sure, is the reason that a lot of people are bald these days. Next in the extremely bad is Covetous Demon from Dark Souls 2, which I don't even know why this fight is in the game. Fat Albert of Dark Souls. This slug, this thing, has almost no moves. It's not a real threat at all. It's more or less a 30-second distraction from you continuing on in the level design. It doesn't even really need to be here. I avoided just outright beating this thing up in the gameplay because I wanted it to last longer for the video. It's an actual joke. I understand for this boss and probably many others in the list that there are lore explanations why some bosses suck or are bad or designed it the way that they are, but in this case, I'm not giving them an excuse. This is just not a good fight. In terms of boss rankings, this is easily one of the lowest of the low, and it's very unmemorable to say the least. The Bed of Chaos is at least memorable. This is not. Would you look at that? Yet another Dark Souls 2 boss being mid? It couldn't be. The Ancient Dragon in DS2 is perhaps the worst dragon fight of any Souls game. It's so bad for a number of reasons. Number one, its dummy health pool is outright foul. Number two, its very limited moveset kind of makes this fight feel very monotonous and repetitive. Very, very easy to abuse AI, and not a great arena if I'm being honest, and it's just not a very well thought out or executed fight that does not play nice with the camera either. Almost everything is wrong about it other than its presentation. I think like its actual, look and feel of it, and like the concept is cool. It's just not a fun or engaging fight. I literally had to speed this footage up because of how monotonous and repetitive this fight can really get. It took me a couple of tries, but once you figure out that it only has like 2 or 3 moves you need to avoid and position yourself in a very key spot, then this fight is just very easily abused, and I don't think that Fromsoftware really had this one dialed in very much. The Ancient Dragon really encapsulates Dark Souls 2's biggest flaw, which is its quantity over quality approach. If you can't look at Ancient Dragon compared to something like Midir later on in Dark Souls 3 and say that one is objectively just much better than the other, then you might need to get your eyes checked because, buddy, I got some news for you. The only thing I feel like they could have done to make this fight more enjoyable is to actually uninstall the game after you've completed this boss. That's about it. While we're on the topic of bad dragon fights, one of the only really bad bosses in Dark Souls 3, in my opinion, is the Ancient Wyvern. And it's almost the same idea as the Ancient Dragon, almost same moveset, to be honest. This one is a little more intricate, but not too much. It's a bit more reactable and readable, and you can do this fight just by hacking away at it if you want to. However, and this is what they should have done with the Ancient Dragon, they gave you an out if you don't want to do the fight like this. You can jump off of this like kind of cliff and then do a plunge attack on it, basically instantly melting the boss. And that is your one-way ticket out of this if you don't want to just sit here for 10 minutes and smacking away at this thing. It's not a great experience because it wasn't in Dark Souls 2, and I'm very surprised they even attempted it in DS3. It's not a good fight in this game nonetheless still, even though they gave you a gimmick in order to skip the boss essentially. And it's not that all dragon fights are bad or I have, a preference against them, because there is another dragon in Dark Souls 3 that's one of the best bosses ever. I'm sure a lot of you know which one I'm talking about. However, the Ancient Wyvern is just not it. It doesn't play nice with the camera. The arena it's on is really bad as well, even probably worse than the Ancient Dragon's arena. Like, it's horrendous, man. Obviously, this one is meant for you to do the gimmick, but if you don't, it's kind of miserable. So, bad boss. Next is yet another giant boss that does not play nice with the camera whatsoever. This is Amygdala from Bloodborne, and it's a really cool looking fight, man. I love the design of this enemy so much, and it appears throughout the game if you play Bloodborne, and you know exactly where it is and stuff like that. You see it a lot, but its fight, it could have been a lot better than it was executed. You're supposed to hit Amygdala either in the arms or the head to deal max damage, but realistically, I found like the most easy and safe strat is just to stay under it and dodge legs until you kill it. It just doesn't seem like this fight was necessarily the most polished or thought out thing, and they wanted to just have this enemy that was clearly made for different parts of the game, but they wanted to use it as a boss, so they kind of just slapped it in and pasted it in this thing. It's okay. It's not as miserable as the Ancient Dragon or Wyvern because it doesn't have an absurd health pool, but it also has a little bit more different moves going on, so it's a little more interesting. I just cannot say it's honestly a very good fight in Bloodborne. Great concept, don't get me wrong, but but very, very flubbed execution. I wasn't sure if I was going to put this one here because it's more or less a side boss, but the Blazing Bull is the only really bad boss in Sekiro, I think. It does not correspond or gel well with Sekiro's combat systems whatsoever. I don't think that this fight is necessarily that fun or even teaches you very valuable lessons, and it's not like a satisfying fight to get good at like something like a Genichiro or Ishin is. I understand nerds on the internet will say that the lesson the Blazing Bull is supposed to teach you is to use the firecrackers and stuff, and like I get that, but forcing a player's hand into using a certain kind of equipment to make a fight really easy or cheesable is just not really my preferred playstyle or way to go, especially this early on in the game. You encounter it quite early, and it's just not very fun. I don't like this boss, but that's the only, I mean, spoilers, a lot of the Sekiro bosses are god tier, so if anything was going to appear down here, it needs to be this one. Next is Celestial Emissary from Bloodborne. I don't really have anything to say about it. It's just one of those giant things with the blue heads, but it's a big one. That's quite literally it. It's got a couple of minions that chase you around, but it's hardly a boss if you could call it that, although it technically does meet the requirements of a boss fight, so I suppose I'll let it slide, but it's pretty bad. After that, we have the Godskin Duo from Elden Ring, which is Ornstein and Smo if they were cringe. This is probably like the worst fight in Elden Ring. If I'm being honest, like as far as main bosses go, this is not good. It takes all of the concepts of what makes duo fights work and throws them out the window. Now, you can fight the Godskin Noble and the Apostle on their own encounters, and you would think that they would have mostly different behavior when putting them together. They pretty much act like you're solo fighting them in their own encounters, but you just slap them into the same room. Also, not to mention, they pull from the same health bar, and so if you happen to kill both of them at the same time before they respawn, nothing happens. Like, you don't get extra rewarded for it, you don't get some kind of bonus for playing really well and optimizing and stuff. You kind of just have this awkward downtime where literally no one is in the field, nobody's fighting, and you just have to wait for another one to respawn, and it's incredibly, incredibly bad. I know this fight is very cheesable. You can summon or you can use sleep pots. There's a million ways to get around this fight if you're really hard stuck on it. But if you want to just actually, you know, play it straight through without using any of these ways to kind of abuse it, then it's probably one of the most unbalanced and incongruent fights in all of Souls games. And for Elden Ring standards, it's kind of impressive how bad it actually is. I was shocked, to be real. This is not even Godskin Duo. This is Ornstein and Smo at home. It's like kind of embarrassing how wrong they get this fight, and for making it mostly a mandatory boss, it's just not acceptable. Next is actually a Bloodborne DLC fight, which is the Living Failures, aka the story of my life. I don't know how they got my likeness into this game, but anyways, this fight is, they said, hey, I heard y'all like Celestial Emissary, so here's 18 of them. The only redeeming factors I'm gonna give this fight is its banger soundtrack. Like, the music's phenomenal, top-notch. It's sad it's wasted on a pathetic joke fight like this, and they have this kind of interesting gimmick move where these meteors and stars fall, very similar to Rom's fight a little bit later on, which I'm sure is kind of just copy pasted from that, but it's just not a very inspired fight. It feels a bit filler, kind of tacked on into the DLC, and doesn't really need to be in this package of fights. This one might surprise you, and it pains me to put it so low, but Seath the Scaleless in Dark Souls 1 is not a good fight for a couple of reasons. Other than its visual presentation, which is top tier, its arena is really bad, and its actual design is not so good either. This is the epitome of Dark Souls 1 not being able to get finished on time and them having to cut corners. I mean, everything about the boss's moveset just feels like it shouldn't be here. It constantly clips through the arena and the walls. It just doesn't, it looks like a mod. Like, for being a polished, you know, Fromsoftware game, it looks like a beta version or like a work in progress of a boss that it doesn't have that final level of polish where it's like, okay, this is the end result. It's missing something, and again, it has so much amazing wasted potential, which is why it's so painful to put it so low. It plays a little nicer with the camera than most giant dragon bosses, but that isn't really saying much in this case. I just think it's held back by, frankly, a lack of the game being done. There's no polish on this, and that takes away from an otherwise very memorable and amazing encounter. Heading over to Demon Souls, we have True King Alliance, which is after you beat, like, basically the last main boss of the game. This is its true form, which is just a giant, pathetic slug that has 2 moves that will not kill you. Like, it's a story boss. You know, I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's some kind of mechanical or intellectual masterpiece. It's not. It's a boss that you smack to death for the purpose of the theme and the actual wrapping up of the story. But otherwise, it's a kind of like hollow way to end the game on, I feel like. I understand why they did it, but I like bosses that end with a really, really memorable encounter, and this one is just not it. Even though it was the first Souls game and perhaps they wanted to try out this as an experiment, I don't think it really worked out too well. Next, we're heading back to Dark Souls 1, and this is gonna be the Ceaseless Discharge, which is not a meme. Well, the name is not a meme, but the fight itself is. There's a way to instantly skip it and knock all of its health, or you can actually just flat out do the fight and smack it dead. It has one move, basically. Essentially one giant arm slam, and that's really all. Not really much to say about it. I don't think this fight is necessarily that polished or finished either. I think it's meant to, like, encounter once and then you figure out the gimmick and then you just skip it. But the good news is Ceaseless Discharge is pretty much our final boss that I would put in, like, probably honestly bottom of the barrel tier. We're moving up just a little bit in the world and going to the pretty bad tier. Wait, actually I lied. There's one more really bad one I want to talk about. The king of bad arenas himself, the Capra Demon. It's not even the actual enemy I have any problem with at all. The 2 dogs that appear in here are more of a threat than the actual main villain and monster here in this situation, and the stupid layout of the arena. I don't know why there's just a random staircase here. It's very boxed in, odd corners. It just doesn't really make any sense, and I understand that they needed to put a boss here, but I can't really get a grasp on why it was designed the way that it was. It will never be a good or high tier fight for me, even though the actual mechanics of said boss are not bad at all. It's all the surrounding circumstances that make this one annoying. But anyways, now we can actually move up a little higher on this totem pole of bosses. This one is going to be the good old Guardian Dragon. Guardian Dragon. I almost said Ancient Dragon. I do put this a slight step above the previous dragons we had, only because they don't have ridiculous health pools. It has a few more interesting moves than those, and it's a more short and sweet fight, right? Like, it's not this entire, like, 10 to 15 minute debacle every single time. You're pretty much in and out. It's a little more flashy, although you can tell this fight is still clearly not done either. It was a huge step in the right direction for dragon fights, no pun intended, but you can tell that they still really had to stretch this to its absolute limits, and they copy-pasted endlessly throughout the rest of this next section. You could say that this fight was preparing you to how to deal with these, but I don't think it really accomplishes that whatsoever. I think all it does is make this fight in this cage a lot less memorable than it otherwise should be, because now there's just a billion of them on the mountains, and that's that. The one thing I will give it credit for is its arena actually feels like it plays nice with this boss's moveset, and it makes the camera feel a hell of a lot better too. So, I mean, that's a giant plus in my opinion. It definitely scores some points for me and prevents it from being bottom tier. I don't even know where to put this one. Ladies and gentlemen, Ludden Zalin is a bad boss. And if you know, you know. It's not even the actual boss themselves, or, you know, the 2 of them that I dislike. They're just 2 of the king's pets, and they're completely fine. I actually really like them. Ava's great, which we'll get to later, but the gimmick of this boss is that once you get the first one to a certain, like, kind of below half health, then the second one joins the fight. That's cool. Completely fine. I actually really like it, and their moveset's beautiful. But the thing that's not okay is the run back to this boss. And I know we're not really talking about run backs in this video, but this one is so exceptional that it's important to mention. It takes over 5 minutes to run from the bonfire back to the boss. It's absolutely absurd, and it makes an otherwise pretty fun or decent encounter in Dark Souls 2 completely painful and foul. The entire frigid outskirts is a downright disaster, and putting Ludden Zalin so far away from the bonfire makes this one not even worth playing, in my opinion. It's, if you've played Ava the King's Pet, and then this is just the same fight, but 2 of them. That's quite literally the entire premise. So I can't put this anywhere above, like, pretty bad. Surprise, surprise, another DS2 boss being mid. The Grave Robbers, you know, honestly, hard to say if I can even classify this as a main boss, but they have a giant health bar, so I suppose we're gonna do it. It's 3 different kinds of archetypes of NPCs that you might find throughout the game, but there's, 3 of them all at once, and this fight is meant to be played co-op. Like, this is quite literally built for the co-op area of Dark Souls, and obviously you can do it with a friend, and it's a lot easier, but you can also do this solo. It's just that each and every single NPC or grave robber has a very different, moveset, equipment, and so on, and you have to just kind of exploit their vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and more or less just survive in the arena until you can slowly wear away at their health and, find openings and such. I actually really do like the different archetypes and the implementation of these grave robbers. I just think it's kind of a wasted potential for what could have been a cool boss in this area and setting. I don't think this would have necessarily been the optimal way to go, but that's just me. Moving over to Dark Souls 1, we have the 4 Kings, and I'm gonna die on this hill. This is a fantastic, phenomenal concept for a boss fight, but a very, very poor execution. And the concept is insane. You jump into the abyss and you're fighting just these 4 entities, and you can't let them stack up or else they will usually snuff you out and overwhelm you. The problem I have with this fight is that I think it actually takes away from all of the lessons that Dark Souls so far has been trying to convey about its combat, which is like finding whiff punish opportunities, exploiting vulnerabilities, and like end lag windows and stuff like that. I think this is more of a DPS race, and that's how it's optimally played. I cannot honestly say that this fight is that fun to replay. Pretty much everyone just runs Havel's armor and then just smacks away at them, and you tank hits. You don't even really bother dodging that much. It's not incredibly useful here, and you need to get in close because they deal more damage the farther you are away. So you're kind of meant to play like this from the get-go. I just don't really think this fight is amazing. Other than its atmosphere and aesthetic quality, which is incredibly unique, the mechanics are underwhelming to say the least. Coming back to Dark Souls 2, we have Prowling Magus and the Congregation. This is not a boss fight. Even though it's appearing in this video and it has a giant health bar, this is not a boss. This is a collection of enemies that happen to have a giant health bar at the bottom. It's really not a boss, and I don't know why Dark Souls 2 had this obsession with passing off these, just giant gank fights as a boss fight. I would be more okay with these kind of gank fights if they were a little more memorable. Like if something unique happened and made it stick out in my memory, I might give these a bit more of a pass. But it doesn't. You kind of forget that this is a boss rather than just a slightly chunkier than normal enemy. And because they put a health bar at the bottom of the screen, apparently automatically makes it a boss fight. And it is in this game, so I had to include it, although it is pretty trash. Cutting back over to Dark Souls 1 is Pinwheel, probably the most memorable fight for being a meme in this game. It was like the original meme as far as easy bosses go. Again, they put a health bar at the bottom of the screen, but realistically, it's a normal enemy that can duplicate itself, which might catch you off guard for a second, but as soon as you catch on, you will delete it in 2 hits flat, and the arena doesn't have anything interesting going on. It's very small, and also, not to mention, it just so happens to be the last checkpoint before the worst area in the game. If you're a Tomb of the Giants enjoyer, then Pinwheel is probably the beginning for you, but hey, I mean, for everyone else, may as well turn the game off. After that, we're going to come over to Demon Souls. This is Phalanx, which is basically the first main boss in the game. Outside of the tutorial fight, this is your first real checkpoint, I would say. And I don't like this boss very much, at least compared to what else is in Demon Souls. Matter of fact, Demon Souls in particular, the boss philosophy was a little bit more gimmicky, as in they have one very specific way that you need to take them down or deal with them or even approach. And Phalanx is no exception to the rule, where you need to damage the center of it to deal the massive amount of damage that you can, but it has a bunch of little tinier guards around it, pretty much constantly protecting it. You can cheese this with fire if you want to. There's a lot of ways to get around this and make it absolutely trivial. I just don't think it's a very good fight, and for the opening of the game, could have been maybe a little bit different in my opinion. Also, let's not pretend that the name doesn't know exactly what it's doing. Continuing on the train of Demon Souls, we have the Dragon God, and this fight I theoretically could have put at the beginning of the video in its own category, but I want to put this here in its own thing. It's not a great fight, although you don't actually fight the main boss itself a whole lot. This is a puzzle boss wherein you need to go find a couple of different things to shoot arrows into its side, and then you finish it off at its head. You don't actually, combat this thing one-on-one, really. You have to meet a couple prerequisites, and I can genuinely applaud Fromsoftware in their first game being extremely experimental in attempting to create a sort of like stealth-based puzzle boss. It's such a strange concept, and for what it's worth, it is memorable the first time around. It's not like something, similarly to these other fights where you walk in, it's just a glorified pool of enemies that have a health bar. This is an actual like cinematic fight that can actually be quite challenging and gratifying once you actually complete it. I would like to see them maybe attempt this concept a little bit better in a more modern game, because as is, I think that their first attempt was good, but leaves a lot of room for improvement. I think in something like Elden Ring or even a future project, we could see this concept really taken to the next level, but it's very okay. Hard shift in games, but very similar premise in terms of boss design. These are going to be the folding screen monkeys from Sekiro, and it's similar to Dragon God because it is a puzzle boss where you gotta kind of play it a very particular way. You're meeting certain prerequisites to beat the boss, not necessarily an actual moment-to-moment duel. So the way that this fight works is you have 4 different monkeys based on the original Japanese proverb of the see no evil, hear no evil, etc., monkeys. And each monkey has a different attribute. One can't see and it's blind, one can't hear, So you have to exploit these vulnerabilities, and there's a very specific way to play it. If you don't know what you're doing and you kind of fumble around in this, it might be a pain in the ass, to be honest. But once you know exactly how it's done, there's a very specific route you can do. It's like one of the easiest fights ever. I don't really give this fight a whole lot of credit for its difficulty, but I think the concept and its design is quite unique. I just don't think it's like, it's not I'm not going to go out of my way to replay it. It's not also really what Sekiro's combat is made for, and I feel like it's kind of just shoehorned in, even though it is really a main boss. Next is Bloodborne's Rom the Vacuous Spider. I have beef with this thing. I don't really have anything against spiders or nothing, and it's actually very similar to Phalanx from Demon Souls. I would say the difference is, at least in that fight, the thing will be kind of aggressive. You can load into this fight. You can just stand there, and as long as you don't kind of get past like the first phase, like soft phase, this thing will never actually touch you. The spiders will genuinely never approach, and you have to play this like bob and weave play style the entire time that I just find incredibly tedious. I do like some things about it, and I feel like it is more interesting than Phalanx and a few of these other, bait and punish bosses, but I cannot say I have ever delighted or looked forward to fighting this boss in repeat playthroughs. It's like an actual slog. Next boss is almost the exact opposite of a slog. I think it's over before it even begins. The old Iron King in Dark Souls 2 has a very impressive setup and look, and I love the atmosphere around this. This could have been such an amazing fight, but not only does its visuals and mechanics kind of hold it back in terms of what like the actual boss is capable of, working through the entire like Iron Keep to end up at this boss should feel a lot more grand and like a finale, and it just doesn't. I think conceptually this had the potential to be Dark Souls 2's maybe coolest fight in the game, or at least a top 5, but in its execution, you can tell that this suffered from a lack of time and budget, and ends up being like honestly one of the most underwhelming fights in Souls games, period. It's like actually kind of sad. Anticlimactic doesn't even come close. Of what's supposed to be one of these like great souls of the game, you're like, oh, like that's it. Next is going to be a Dark Souls 3 boss. It's been a minute since we've had one on here, but this is Osiros the Consumed King, and I have to say the more I play against this boss, the less I actually like it, which is usually the opposite. Typically, the more I play against a boss and learn it and understand it, the more I enjoy it. But for this fight, I think the more I play it, the more I'm beginning to grow tired of it. He's actually kind of the opposite of like Malekith or Ludwig from Bloodborne, where like he starts out very animalistic, and once you get into certain health, he becomes, on all fours. He uses a weapon and fights more chivalristic. This is the opposite. He starts with the weapon, and then after a certain limit on his health, he then becomes a lot more primal, and he gets on all fours and starts kind of going crazy. It's a neat concept. I just cannot say that it's one of my favorite fights ever. Now buckle up, fellas, because we got a few Dark Souls 2 bosses to cover now. We have the Executioner's Chariot next, and this is, yes, a puzzle boss, but also a real boss to a degree. The way this works is you have this open looped room, which you need to kill witches or necromancers that will constantly be reviving these skeletons. Eventually, you make your way to the back of the room where you can close the gate on this chariot that is constantly looping and trying to deal damage and outright kill you, and once slamming the gate shut, you will then be able to finally deal damage after knocking the Executioner's Chariot down. I think the actual chariot boss is completely fine. You even find it as a regular enemy later in the game. I don't have much problem with it, but my problem, just like Lud and Zullen, is the run back to this is horrible for a not very entertaining boss whatsoever. Again, can't really say I look forward to doing this one. It's not particularly hard once you understand the gimmick, but if you're going in blind, it's going to take you 1 or 2 tries before you really can understand, what the hell is happening. I think a small change that could have made this fight a bit better was number 1, shorten the run back, but also have these necromancers and skeletons, maybe a few regular enemies along the way so that you kind of learn to deal with this as you get into the fight. Would have been a really nice little hint to convey the player to look out for that as they get in here instead of just kind of doing gotcha moments. Next up, continuing in Dark Souls 2 is the Skeleton Lords, and again, not really a boss fight. I don't like even putting it in the traditional definition of one. It is a collection or cluster of enemies that happens to have a health bar. Very similar to the Prowling Magus in the Church Boys, but these guys are a little different. I would say that this fight definitely gets a few more points for me because it doesn't feel as pathetic as the Church one. The pinwheel, like the rolling skeletons are back from Dark Souls 1. There's just a sheer number of enemies that kind of can be intimidating at first. So at least for presentation, it scores a couple points, and I think it's a lot more visually interesting than that last fight. But again, cluster of enemies, not really a boss. I don't have much to say about it other than that. We seem to be on a bit of a streak right now. A trend is being followed, and continuing in Dark Souls 2 is going to be the Royal Rat Vanguard, which I think I can understand the concept of what they wanted to do with this fight, right? You walk into this underground catacomb, and all of a sudden, you're trapped in this room, you're getting swarmed by rats. It's supposed to be like this frantic, hectic feeling thing where you're trying to find a way out. The way this fight works is you need to kill a couple of rats, and then eventually, one with a health bar is going to spawn, which is actually the Royal Rat Vanguard, and it's only denoted by a slight tuft of black hair on the top of its head, and it moves around a little bit differently compared to the other ones. Maybe it's a little bit bigger, but otherwise it's not like super noticeably different, and you have to kill this one in order to beat the fight. Otherwise you're killing rats endlessly. I just don't think this fight is that fun. I don't think it captures the feel that they intended it to have. Dark Sun Gwendolyn from DS1 is such a weird fight. It's kind of optional, like it's sort of a secret fight that you have to do something very specific in order to access it in the game. So while it's not a mainstay boss, it does have a few interesting properties. Not all of them I can say I love. It's one almost infinite hallway, and you essentially just chase him down as he throws attacks at you. He's only got 3 different moves though. 2 of them can be blocked by just hiding behind the pillars, and then one of them you actually have to roll or dodge out of the way. I can't say that this fight is honestly awesome. It's like pretty much a one and done, and you're like, okay, I did that. I'm done with it now. There's not much to like learn here. There's not much to talk about other than that. The coolest thing about the fight is not the fight itself. It's accessing it, and also its presentation and atmosphere and visuals are certainly unique, but that's essentially all the praise I can give it. Other than that, it's mid. And speaking of mid, next is going to be Mikolash, host of the Nightmare from Bloodborne. The more I've played this fight, the lower it actually gets ranked for me. I was initially fairly positive on it at first, or at least neutral on it, but the more I play it, the more I dislike it, and the reason is there's just too much gimmick stuff going on. And I know gimmick gets thrown around a lot, but this is an actual like proper song and dance ritual you have to do to even engage with the fight. So you start out, you walk through the fog wall, and you need to chase him down through a series of hallways in order to pin him in this room right here. And once you do, you can kind of slap him up as long as you want to. Then after a little while, he'll leave, and then he does the same thing. He walks through another mirror, you chase him down a little bit again to get him to the second room where you can then proceed to slap him up once more. My main problem with this fight is like, sure, it's kind of entertaining and fun to learn how the stupid gimmick works the first time around. You know, it's a funny little prank that he pulls, and haha, we got it. But once you know the gimmick, it becomes way less entertaining to do. It feels like a chore. It's very tedious. His actual moveset is not that complicated. He has like 2 moves, if that, and that's really, maybe 3 moves, but other than that, it's not a very engaging fight, and its gimmick gets old really, really fast. Afterwards, we got the Fire Giant from Elden Ring, and this is, again, one of my least favorite fights in the game, although I cannot say it's like an outright bottom of the barrel. It's really not. It's okay for what it is, and it has a couple of interesting things going on. Number one, the Giant, you can pretty much stay under him the entire time with Torrent, and you are virtually safe as long as you know where to position. Its first phase is mostly straightforward. Its second phase is like if you get hit by one move, it's pretty much over. All of his moves are slow. They have incredibly long windups. They're extremely telegraphed, but they are devastating. And if you do get hit, it's basically game over. I don't know if I love these kinds of bosses where you're pretty much camping out this giant entity and just kind of doing chip damage until it finally reaches 0. It's a little bit tedious in my opinion, although it does have a couple interesting mechanics where if you do somehow score a posture break on the Fire Giant, which is definitely doable, you can get massive damage if you punish the giant eye that's on the front of it. So there's a little bit you can do in order to speed up this fight, and it's not a complete slog if you play it a few different ways, but I don't know, its moveset is not that interesting. Its visuals are cool the first time around, and like its presentation is neat or whatever, but it's not one of the best fights in the game, not by a long shot, but it's good. Next is going to be the one reborn from Bloodborne, and if we were ranking bosses sheerly on their atmosphere, their visuals, and their presentation, this boss would honestly be maybe a top 3 for me ever. However, that's not exactly the parameters we're ranking on today, and the One Reborn, other than its amazing presentation and just like sheer atmosphere, does not hold up mechanically, and its fight is way less than stellar when you actually play it. So this is a great one, essentially reborn of human body parts, and it's just this giant amalgamation of stuff that you can kind of beat up. Obviously, it makes sense that it's not the most powerful thing because it's a fraud, etc., but still, I don't think that the fight necessarily lives up to its expectation. There's also these witches around the arena that can buff it, and it's very similar to Tower Knight in Demon Souls, which we'll get to later, where you need to kind of deal with those first before you can actually fight the main boss. But, you know, other than that, there isn't a whole lot to say about the One Reborn, other than it's a very underwhelming mechanical fight, but an amazing visual presentation and atmosphere. Probably one of my favorite in Souls ever. So next is actually another amazing presentation boss and great atmosphere, but very, let's say, underwhelming mechanics. This is going to be High Lord Wolnir from Dark Souls 3, which I can understand putting this boss in the point of the game that they did, but I honestly cannot say that I look forward to doing this one. Basically, the only way you'll die in this fight is by the insta-kill smoke that will kind of just appear randomly, or maybe a few skeleton boys that might catch you off guard. But you got to destroy these rings on its wrists, and it takes it down its health in thirds, so you got to destroy all 3, and then that's the end of the fight. There really isn't much to it other than that, and again, even for a like presentation slash atmosphere boss, I think it's good, but I also don't think it's awesome in that respect either. It's one of the most forgettable fights in the game, in my opinion, and I cannot say that I have that much fun with it, although it's okay, it exists, I suppose. So next we have Dirty Colossus, which is what they used to call me back in college. You know how in cartoons they draw like a stinky person with lines and a bunch of flies around them? That is quite literally what is going on with this boss, and otherwise it's one of the most like unremarkable, least memorable bosses ever. It's got like 4 or 5 moves. They're all very easily avoidable. It's very simple to take down with melee, and it's incredibly weak to magic and fire, so any build is going to be more than viable against this. I think this is one of those pushover bosses you get in Demon Souls that aren't really supposed to stump you for too long. Kind of a confidence booster, if you will, because like other than its somewhat interesting presentation, there really isn't much else to mention here. It's not an outright bad boss, like it's not offensive in any way, so I can't really put it bottom tier, but it's just very uninteresting. Next is another fight I don't particularly love, and again, it's a Dark Souls 3 boss. Even though it does have a pretty stellar lineup, this is one of the weaker ones. I suppose this could be considered an optional fight unless you don't want to actually be able to have the ability to use, you know, boss souls for weapons or equipment or whatever. You got to beat the Cursed Rod of Greatwood if you're going to do that. But the cool thing about this fight is that eventually he breaks through the floor. You can't just simply run up to this thing and start smacking away at it wherever. It has these like pus-filled like orbs on it, and these are the weak points in which they're only vulnerable there. And after getting it to about half health, you will fall through the floor into a brand new arena. This is a little bit more cramped and dangerous, and it also gets a little bit of different moves down here too. I can't say the Curse Rotted Greatwood is really even that fun to fight. It's more like you kind of have to do it. It's like a chore a little bit, and other than its unique visuals, there's nothing special about this fight mechanically, and I don't really like playing against it that much. I often praise Dark Souls 3 for having probably like the best boss lineup in terms of batting average. It doesn't have my favorite bosses ever in all of Souls, but it doesn't really miss too much. But if I had to say, the Curse Rotted Greatwood is going to be a miss. Now, good news, because this next boss is pretty much the last one in what I'm going to consider in the category of slightly below average. These are the Witches of Hemwick. I don't really like this fight a whole lot, and it can definitely vary depending on a variety of factors, the most important one being your level of insight, and these can determine basically the amount of creatures that are in this besides the witches themselves. A lot of people claim that if you go into this fight with no insight, then any of the other shadow monsters do not appear in this fight, although when I did this, they still appeared, so I'm not really sure exactly how to make that happen. I would just say that this fight can be relatively inconsistent, and the witches can also revive each other, so the trick is to kill them within a rapid, time succession. You've got to eliminate one and quickly eliminate the other before they're able to, revive one another. Otherwise, they'll just do it infinitely. Cool concept. I just think it can get a little repetitive, and it's not that fun otherwise. Let's go back in time a bit to Dark Souls 1. Near the end of the game in Lost Izalith, the Centipede Demon is a great idea. Like, this hellish centipede would be one of the coolest fights conceptually as a monster. But again, it's at this point in the game where it was clearly just like not ready. This boss genuinely does not even look finished. The arena you played in is really scuffed, and there's not even that much playable space. It's constantly clipping through the walls. Its moveset is very simplistic. It's just not a great fight, to be honest. Like, it's fun enough when you play it for the first time, but you realize how repetitive it gets and just unfinished the monster itself looks when paying close attention. Let's stay on this game and talk about the Gaping Dragon in Dark Souls 1 with another amazing visual presentation, and I love the look and design of this boss. It's phenomenal. What I don't love, however, is the boss's moveset. I find it to be a little bit simplistic and just kind of repetitive for a boss of this nature. I do like the fact that you can cut its tail off and get a weapon, and it completely eliminates one of its most powerful moves, which is awesome. It's a great thing to know if you're going into this fight and you happen to be struggling with it or whatever. If it didn't have these very unique visuals and its design being something out of an actual like horror book, I don't think that this fight would be memorable whatsoever. Let's move over to Royal Rat Authority in Dark Souls 2, which again I feel is a more below average fight. This begins off with a couple of rats before the actual main boss shows up that try to make you toxic before you even fight the main giant rat. Although as for him, he's basically Great Grey Wolf Sif from Dark Souls 1 if he were mid. The thing is, the whole area that, this boss appears in is actually made for PvP anyways, so they kind of just slapped this together, and you can tell that that's like one of the only reasons this fight is even in the game. They had to have some kind of boss that justifies this area's existence in Dark Souls 2 other than being a PvP-centered arena, so they kind of just made a giant rat with the mechanics of Sif and said, you're done. Let's give a little bit of a mention to Leechmonger. I don't have that much to say about this fight. It's kind of like Dirty Colossus, honestly, copy-pasted, but instead of like dirt and flies around it, it's leeches. It's the same idea, just a little bit less mobile. I also don't love the arena it's in. Again, you have like a small amount of space to work with, there's some water in it, and a pointless amount of stairs around this area. I'm not gonna lie, I actually totally forgot this boss was a thing until I was making my list in order to rank these. I was like, what the hell is a Leechmonger? I had to go and look at it again because I don't even remember fighting it. So very unmemorable, but I suppose it is a Demon Souls boss. Let's move over and talk about Dark Beast Parl from Bloodborne. It's a fight that, again, I think has a little bit of the same issues as Bloodstarved Beast with its animations being a little wonky, but it is really cool having like a seemingly random patch of gravel turn into an actual boss fight. It's a hella unique like presentation and setup and intro, and it is cool having like an electric charged beast, although that's pretty much as far as the positives go for me. You can't parry it, which kind of sucks, and it doesn't have a ton of moves, honestly, although the ones that it does have are pretty cool and fairly devastating, so you have to watch out and be careful, but it's an okay boss. I just can't say that I love it. Alright, so we're also going to knock these two out right now, the Dragon Rider plus the twin Dragon Riders in Dark Souls 2. The first one is in Hyde's Tower of Flame, and this fight is the other alternate tutorial boss. If you don't fight the last giant first, then you'll probably encounter this one. It does appear as a regular enemy at some point later in the game near King Vendrick, which is, you know how I feel about that. It can kind of annoy me, but they also reuse it again in the twin Dragon Riders fight, and this is also in Drangleic Castle, and it's the exact same mechanics, roughly speaking. There's one that has a bit of a different skin, and one of them's got a couple ranged attacks, but I believe it has far less health than the other one. Again, this is another fight that I kind of forgot even happened because it's over so quickly, and it's just, there's not much to remember about it, to be honest. If you're noticing a pattern here that a lot of these mid-ass fights are from Dark Souls 2, well, that's kind of, that was their whole thing. There's a lot of fights in the game, you know, there's a huge number of them, but most of them are not very good. And I feel nothing exemplifies that middery better than the Belfry Gargoyles, specifically in Dark Souls 2, because this is a fight that in DS1 works really well, but they completely throw the formula out the window, introducing a large number of these gargoyles that can appear at the same time. I believe up to 5 total, which completely breaks the arena and the flow and the layout of this fight, changes the rhythm entirely, and making everything that worked about the original fall flat on its face. I don't like this one in Dark Souls 2 that much, although it does have enough DNA from that original fight to not make it totally awful. It's more an example of Dark Souls 2 as a whole, where they looked at the original Dark Souls game and said, hey, let's try and recreate that without really understanding what made it work. And like that's literally what this fight is all about. It's trying to be Dark Souls 1 without understanding why that fight actually works. It was designed in a very specific way with, you know, a very particular arena and a specific number of enemies that make this function. It just doesn't work in this game, and I don't know what they were thinking. It's not good. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Moonlight Butterfly in Dark Souls 1. It's one of those fights that made me go, whoa, what is this thing? Like, it catches you so off guard from its design to its presentation. It doesn't necessarily feel like it belongs in this game, which makes it that much more fascinating. But its mechanics are really dull and boring. It's a fight that's almost entirely ranged, meaning if you are playing a melee build, almost the only punish options you'll have are when the butterfly lands for a short period of time on the railing. Otherwise, you gotta throw stuff at it or use spells or whatever. It does not feel like the Moonlight Butterfly is a finished or completed boss. The polish isn't necessarily there, and I can't say I agree with its design either. It's a fight that you'll get through very quickly once you understand it and know how to fight it. It's just a little bit too slow and boring for my liking. I don't enjoy fighting the Moonlight Butterfly anymore just because it doesn't really work for me and my pace and what I enjoy. Something else that doesn't really work for me is the Demon of Song in Dark Souls 2. It's not even the boss that I mostly dislike. It's in the worst area of the game. The Demon of Song is how you cap off the Shrine of Amana, which is the most stressful, annoying, and janky area that Dark Souls 2 has ever concocted. And this fight, the only thing fun going on with it is it becomes invulnerable when it puts this little hood over its face. You can punish it as it's opening or as it's closing, but not while it's shut, and it has maybe 2 or 3 moves to its name. It's something that you're probably not gonna ever die on, to be honest. Like, it's very, very easy, but I appreciate its little gimmick. It's just not very fun at all. So everything prior was a boss that I consider really bad or below average or even slightly below average. Now we get to the point where there's a lot of like middle of the road bosses that aren't necessarily great, but they're not terrible either. And we're going to start with the Fool's Idol from Demon's Souls. And it's worth talking about how this functions for just a second because it is very gimmicky, although I think it's a fun gimmicky boss to some degree. The Fool's Idol is just a boss that kind of teleports around the room and has these trap circles on the ground. If you step into them, you get shocked and sets you up for another attack, and you'll most likely take a lot of damage. And she'll teleport to another location after taking a certain amount of damage from the player, and worse yet, she will multiply herself, and killing the duplicates do not hurt her own health bar. But the cool trick to this fight is that if you're paying attention, you'll notice that the real Fool's Idol has a lot brighter magic than the duplicates, so there's a tell right away of which one you should be going for. You need to kind of remember where these circles are, as they're not visible unless you step into them, and knowing where you can and cannot walk can be a little bit of a tricky affair sometimes, but it's definitely not too hard once you understand the gimmick. The really annoying part is there's some guy that's up in like a closet, and if you don't kill him first, he will infinitely revive this boss, and it's cruel to a point of almost unfairness, I would say. If you're going into this game blind, there's almost no way you know about that, so I think that might be taking it a little too far, but chances are, if you're going in blind and don't know much about this game, you're going to be doing this fight at least twice. Next up is going to be Champion's Grave Tender and the Great Wolf, and I would say that this fight could do without the actual Grave Tender. I think he's kind of a pointless addition in this fight, even though it kind of makes it a more interesting dynamic when there's two different enemies on the battlefield, but he's very easy to kill and shouldn't present you with too much trouble. The Great Wolf definitely can. I feel like it's certainly like fighting Sif in Dark Souls 1. Very similar concept. I just don't feel like it's quite as well done here, and it's not nearly as memorable in my opinion, and I think it's like solid, but it's the worst fight of this particular DLC, that's for sure. Everyone's favorite giant moose fight is the Regal Ancestor Spirit in Elden Ring. One of the few bosses that can legitimately heal itself during the fight, and this one deserves to because it's not particularly dangerous. Its moves aren't as devastating as maybe you would expect it to be, and this fight is certainly more about the spectacle than anything. It makes me really appreciate how just fascinating and gorgeous Elden Ring's visuals and art can be, but its mechanics are nothing to really scoff at either. It's a pretty damn solid fight, and it's something that I enjoy doing on every single playthrough. The downside is it can be kind of annoying for melee-based builds because it spends a lot of time teleporting around the arena and jumping up in the air, and so if you don't have much tools to deal with that kind of play, then you need to wait for its windows when it does actually become grounded again. If you want, you can more or less just wait it out and let the boss approach you instead, which it certainly will. It'll just take a little while. A little bit of patience in this fight goes a long way, but otherwise, I think it's a pretty good boss. I like it a lot. Not one of my favorites in Elden Ring, but is certainly a memorable one, no matter the case. So if we're talking about bosses with good visuals and presentation, I mean, the Regal Ancestor Spirit does great, but also Vicar Amelia in Bloodborne, I would say, is just on the same level. This fight is pretty good. I like it a lot, and I think it's the first, maybe real tutorial boss that shows you a different kind of playstyle. Father Gascoigne always gets credit for being the first like main tutorial boss, and that's true, and it teaches you that you can stay and be aggressive during the entire fight. Vicar Amelia is the first boss in Bloodborne that forces you to adopt a different kind of playstyle, and I think that's very interesting. She can also heal herself just like the Ancestor Spirit as well. There's a few different versions of the Beast archetype fight in Bloodborne specifically, and I think Vicar Amelia is a very good one. It's a good representation of it. It's not my favorite personally, but I think it's a good way to open the game as it does, and it's in a good placement. You can also use fire, or you can use summons for this if Vicar Amelia is giving you particularly a hard time. I think this boss stumped a lot of people when the game first came out, because it does force you to play so different up to what the game has taught you thus far. If I had a slight criticism for this boss, I'm going to say that her, like, effects, and what I mean is, like, all of the little entrails and just all the fur on her, really obscure what this boss is doing. I don't even know what move startups are happening half the time because I physically can't see. And I think that if the, character design were a little more clean and I could actually see what the hell is happening a lot of the time, I would, have far less issues with this. I think the design kind of holds it back just from a visual perspective, but it's not a massive deal. It's just a slight annoyance, I would say. Next up is going to be a gimmick boss from Dark Souls 3, which is Yorm the Giant, and I say gimmick boss not necessarily because it has like a bullshit move or whatever. It's just because there is a particular weapon at the back of the arena that you're supposed to use against it. So you either find that out and use it your first time, or you go back and upgrade it and then figure it out later, whatever. But basically, this thing will knock it over, deal tons of damage, and allow it to become vulnerable. Otherwise, you can use a regular weapon against Yorm. It's just going to take you absolutely forever. You are clearly meant and designed to use this weapon in the fight, although if you really want to, you know, push your build, you can use other stuff as well. It's just not really built for that. I can't say this is my favorite kind of gimmick fight in which they give you a weapon to take care of it. I think it's one of the weaker implementations, even compared to stuff like Demon Souls, which we'll get to, but it's okay. It's fine. Again, very, very average. But while we're on the topic of giants, let's talk about the last giant from Dark Souls 2. Now, this game, DS2, does not really have a tutorial boss, similarly to basically every other game, to some extent has a boss that you fight really near the opening. This is not the case. You can fight the last giant first, and I feel like most players do. It's probably the easiest one to start with, and it's very, very simple. It's got only a handful of moves and uses a giant stick as a weapon. That's very easy to avoid. I don't think this boss plays as nice with the camera as maybe it should for an opening boss of this nature, but it's not like an outright offensive or terrible boss either. It's pretty average. It's like the definition of average, I would say. And while we're here, we may as well talk about the second time you fight this boss, which is the Giant Lord inside of the memory. It's the exact same character. It's like the same giant, although this time, it's supposed to be more in his prime. He's more active. He's got a weapon. He has a little bit more active moves. Health is feels about the same, I would say. It greatly depends on your build and your level and everything, but it's practically the same fight. There isn't much real difference between these two bosses, and they play pretty much one and the same. Let's shift over to Demon Souls now and talk about the Adjudicator. So again, as I said earlier, almost every boss in Demon Souls has a gimmick or otherwise a very specific weakness. This is encapsulated no better than the Adjudicator's 2 weak points that you need to hit in order to deal damage. You can't do any damage to its body, as in like the actual like main chunk of it. You have to damage this cleaver that's wedged inside his stomach to move it around and cause blood loss, etc. And when it does, you deal enough damage, it'll fall over, and then you have to smack the golden bird on top of its head in order to deal real damage to the boss. I think the Adjudicator's fun. I actually don't really have much of a problem with this at all. I think it's entertaining. I think the arena is pretty bad for it, to be honest. It's a very small, compact space down here with a bunch of pointless stairs and like ledges, maybe for magic builds or whatever. I don't really know. I think the arena is kind of bad for this particular boss, but I understand maybe why it is the case. Otherwise, it's okay, and I do have some fun with this one. Next, we've got Blood-Starved Beast from Bloodborne, and I talked about beast fights a little bit with Vicar Amelia, but the thing I really like about this one is the fact that it's a beast fight that is actually parryable using your gun, and I think that one of the downsides of a lot of the beast fights in Bloodborne is the fact that it kind of nullifies that entire mechanic. It doesn't gel as well with the Bloodborne systems as I feel like they could. Blood-Starved Beast is the exception to that rule, though, and I think this fight's a lot of fun. What I don't really prefer, or in hindsight, I feel is a bit of a drawback. Its animations, especially in 30 FPS for this boss in particular, can feel and look really janky. It's perfectly parryable, but it moving so erratic and kind of like sloppy makes this fight feel very unpredictable, which does add a certain element of tension to it for sure. I will give it that. It's a definitely intense fight that will raise your blood pressure, and I like it. It's good, not one of the best, but it's all right. All right, you know what? We're gonna go ahead and knock these three out at the same time because I don't want to talk about these three different bosses and pretend that they're meaningfully different because they're not. We have the Asylum Demon, the Stray Demon, and Demon Fire Sage in Dark Souls 1. So the first one is the opening tutorial boss, which I feel is one of the best tutorial bosses that Souls has ever had. It's excellently set up. But the thing is, they do repeat this boss quite frequently. The second one is an optional boss when you return to the Asylum and you fight the Stray Demon underground. This fight is a lot more intricate. It's got an expanded moveset, and it has a ton more health. This can be a slightly challenging fight if you're not expecting it, and I think it's probably the best iteration of this boss. It feels like it's actually been leveled up. It feels like it's matched you as you've progressed through your journey and gotten more powerful and so on. It actually feels like a good matchup. This battle with the Stray Demon feels like the, encounter you were meant to have against this monster. The first one was just a setup, but that was the real fight. Now, Demon Fire Sage stage gets reused later in the game, actually near the end. And there is no difference in moveset, really, or in any properties of the Demon Fire Sage versus the Stray Demon. They are a literally copy-paste of one another with a slightly different skin. And they know it's copy-paste because they were having trouble finishing the game on time, so they had to kind of make do. But these bosses are good, it's just that you fight them a lot, and it gets a little repetitive, not gonna lie. Next is gonna be everyone's favorite pushover, the Iron Golem from Sen's Fortress in Dark Souls 1. I like the concept of this fight, right? This big, hunking, giant tank of armor that seems impossible to take down until you realize you can knock it over and deal either tons of damage or just outright make it fall off the map. It's a cool idea. I don't think its execution is awesome in this game, but I can very much see the vision of what they were going for, and I think it's kind of fun. Now, to piggyback off of that, I want to talk about the Armored Warrior from Sekiro, because it's basically the exact same idea, just done in a way that I really like. The Iron Golem can either be killed outright just by dealing damage to it, or it can be virtually insta-killed by pushing it off the cliff. The Armored Warrior in Sekiro, however, has to be killed by making it fall off the bridge. Otherwise, you can land as many death blows on it as you want and deal as much chip damage as you like. It will never go down until you actually do push it off. But the way it's done is actually so amazing, and I think this is like, while it's not a main boss, I think it's worth talking about in this context. Now, I want to add a slight caveat to what I said earlier about Vicar Amelia's boss fight and talk about the Cleric Beast for a moment, which is the real true first main boss beast that you'll fight in Bloodborne. I guess my point was Vicar Amelia, I think, does a better job at making you employ different strategies against it. The Cleric Beast is good, and I think he teaches that to some degree, but I also feel as being a beginner boss, a lot of people kind of just fumble through this one and got lucky and maybe didn't really know exactly what made this boss work or how they properly got through it. It's not as hard as Vicar Amelia, not by a long shot, but it's fun and it's a good fight. And not to mention, the soundtrack is absolutely sinister. It's so good. The presentation and visuals of this fight are unforgettable. And the Cleric Beast, I think people really associate with Bloodborne as a game. It's one of the most identifiable creatures in this entire series, and more specifically, Bloodborne as a whole. Next, let's talk about Elden Ring, and more specifically, Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon. This boss fight has a very interesting structure. Firstly, it starts out in a really distinct way where, in order to deal damage to the main boss, you first need to knock out this giant yellow shield, and you do that by killing 3 of these special glowing, crawling things on the ground. Only then can you break the shield and actually make Rennala herself vulnerable. Once you kill her in this phase, you then go over to phase 2, in which everything completely changes, including the room you're in and the entire environment. She also starts using her own moves instead. And it's here you find out that Rennala is actually a filthy casual herself, because she uses summons. And so, you know, I don't even want to hear it. This fight is, it's different. As a plus, I can't say this fight ever gets really repetitive or anything, because the phases switch up fairly fast. They're both really different. And the creatures that she summons are what seems completely random. So you could get an entire dragon to spawn like I did, or you can get like the most pathetic creature in the game to spawn. It's completely RNG as far as I can tell, and that will definitely determine your experience to some degree, but I think it's a pretty interesting fight. Let's move back over to Dark Souls 2 and talk about the Pursuer. Honestly, one of my favorite fights in Dark Souls 2, despite being quite simple. It only appears once as an actual boss encounter, in which you can use these ballistas in the arena to completely melt it and not even really take the fight, but it also appears at various points in the game when you're kind of just doing your own things throughout the level design, although it doesn't appear as a boss. It doesn't have a giant health bar or anything, but the Pursuer is your classic sword and shield opponent. It's got a nice rhythm to its fight, and it just is very intuitive and it makes sense. I like the Pursuer a lot, to be honest. Up next, let's talk about the Taurus Demon from Dark Souls 1, which outside of the tutorial boss with the Asylum, this is going to be your first real, like, main checkpoint boss. And it's interesting because the arena is quite strange. It's this small, you know, very compact bridge, but you are able to do plunge attacks from the opening, like how you were taught earlier. I do find it interesting that a lot of the bosses in early game of Dark Souls 1 really teach you to do this plunging attack method for dealing with them, but then they pretty much completely nullify that strategy at a lot of the later parts in the game. In the middle, and especially near the end, that just doesn't really become a viable option anymore. So it's strange that this is taught so early on, but it's just one of those Dark Souls 1 behaviors. Let's move over to Dark Souls 2 and Scorpionus Najka, who is the Chaos Witch Quelaag at home, which, you know, we'll get to that in a second. It's a boss I like a lot more, but it's very clearly trying to emulate that. I don't think Scorpionus Najka quite gets there mechanically, but I think her visuals are awesome, and no, not the way you're thinking. One of the biggest differences between her and the fight she's based off of is Najka can actually travel under the sand, temporarily becoming invulnerable and repositioning to maybe set up a strike that you're not expecting. It's a really cool mechanic that I don't think many bosses even utilize in Souls games. It's a very rare one to come across, and I also think it can be kind of a difficult one to get right because you can only track her movement through these like faint dust, you know, smoke piles. They're actually kind of low key, and it's a fun little gimmick to the fight that I think really separates it from its original counterpart. She doesn't move quite as gracefully or rhythmically as Chaos Witch does, but it's again kind of like the generic, you know, cheaply done version of that fight, which I suppose is maybe better than nothing, but I don't really know. It's fine. It's a pretty good fight, to be honest. Heading over to Dark Souls 3, let's talk about the Crystal Sage, which I think on paper is an extremely easy fight and most practically should be depending on the build you're using. I feel like the variety of your experience is almost entirely dependent on that. Your build will almost entirely determine your experience, and some can be a nightmare to use against these. It's very similar to the Fool's Idol, where, you know, the Crystal Sage will duplicate itself and you've got to track down the real one, which can be tricky business sometimes. And while I don't think this boss gives people nearly as much trouble as many others in Dark Souls 3, and certainly not as much as Fool's Idol probably gave people in Demon Souls, I do think it's a good way to refine that idea and formula. Getting rid of those like annoying ass traps on the ground right next to the points where you ideally want to deal damage to them is huge, and, you know, making the bosses maybe have a bit more health and powerful moves is a good trade-off. I like Crystal Sage, and I do think it's a perfection on a formula to some degree. Alright, so this is going to be a little different. We're going to get a bit of a 2-for-1 here. We have Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin from Dark Souls 2, and then Moon Presence from Bloodborne. And the reason I'm putting two bosses from separate games together is because functionally they are kind of the same. In a lot of ways, while they have slightly different moves, you actually set them up or encounter them in almost an identical way. So throughout the game of Dark Souls 2, you might encounter Aldia, and if you talk to him enough and, you know, do his little quest and speak to him throughout the game, he will appear as the actual final boss at the end of the game. There's a few of Fromsoftware's titles where you need to make very intricate and specific deliberate choices throughout the game to encounter an extra final boss when you get to the very end. Otherwise, you may not get the ending that you wanted, and you may miss out on some content. Aldia was added with the Scholar of the First Sin edition, obviously hence the name, but I don't think many people are dying to this fight. It's not, you know, regarded as one of the best fights in Souls. It's a story boss at the end of the day that is there for essentially narrative reasons only, and it's the same deal with Moon Presence in Bloodborne. Once again, the situation is you need to make very specific choices in order to encounter Moon Presence after the game's like real final boss, but this is more or less a story boss. While it still can kill you, it's got a very limited move set, and it's there for you to kind of just beat it up and finish the game. I like both of them in terms of their presentation, but I can't say they're the most fun bosses to actually play against. If I had to pick one, I think I still like Moon Presence more. All right. I don't know if this is controversial. I'm sick of pretending that the Armor Spider isn't at least a pretty decent boss. I feel like I've seen the Armor Spider ranked a lot lower than maybe it should be, and obviously it's personal preference and taste, but I really like what the Armor Spider represents and a lot of its moveset. What I don't really care for is moves that force you to the back of arena for a certain amount of time before you can approach again. Stuff like that can be a little obnoxious where, you know, you kind of have to deal damage in phases, and that's fine, but it has moves that are like perfectly reactable, and as far as I can tell, most builds in the game are, and playstyles for that matter, will be viable against it, and it's a fun and fair fight once you get the rhythm and it clicks. I think it's probably one of the better fights in Demon Souls. So we've just left the realm of bosses that I would say are pretty average. You know, they're good or they're passable or they're decent. They're not, you know, really stand out one way or another. Now we're entering the realm of slightly above average, or something that I would consider to have at least one property or attribute that is exceptional, that really sets them apart and that I like about them. And to start us off in this category, we have the Corrupted Monk from Sekiro. Just the regular one, not the true, which we'll get to later. The differences between these two are mostly just in death blow marks and stuff like that, but also this this is in this like phantom or ghost form. And so I feel this version encourages to use something like Lapis just to wear down its health bar instead of trying to break its posture meter, which is very difficult because the Corrupted Monk, she has some of the fastest recovering posture in the entire game, but her moveset can, you know, definitely make that posture bar add up if you know how to read and respond to it. The rhythm is set right away, and it's probably one of the most fun to get good at and learn. I also feel the Corrupted Monk shows that Sekiro bosses don't need to be insanely fast-paced for them to be fun. This fight is fairly fast, but not, you know, aggressively quick. And it strikes the proper balance between, you know, wanting to get good at parrying and learning to break posture, but also wearing away at health bars and, you know, getting in chip damage while you can. It's a great learning tool as well. Now, staying on Sekiro here, the next fight is another 2-for-1. Let's talk about the Headless Ape and the Guardian Ape. So this boss you encounter quite a few times, and I mean, you have to fight both versions. It's very strange. So you fight the Guardian Ape. He's just a normal giant monkey. You kill him once in this encounter, and you think he's dead, only for him to revive himself and then become the Headless Ape after he, like, cuts his own head off with his sword necklace. And then the caterpillar takes over his body and starts fighting very different. He starts using a weapon, and it's an entirely different moveset now. Now, after this encounter, you do fight another one in the caves, the Headless Ape. This fight, I think, is technically optional, although not really if you go a certain path in the game, so we'll talk about it regardless, but it's two of the apes now. One of them is already headless, and then the other one is the normal Guardian Ape with about half the moveset of the original Guardian Ape, if you're still following. So I say I like the solo encounter here a lot more that you're seeing. It's a much better introduction, and the Shinobi execution switch up will pretty much get anybody, you know, playing your first time around. Nobody saw that coming. And then the one where you fight two of them is a little sloppier. The arena's not quite as good, and having to fight the second monkey with like a little bit less health and not as many moves just feels kind of ganky for no reason in a game where gank fights don't really work well to begin with. I know I'm kind of ranking them together, but they are very different fights in some way, and while they're not my favorite, they're certainly better in a bubble than, like, I don't know, like 60% of what's on this list. So I can't hate it too much. It's just not a fight that I look forward to playing in Sekiro all the time compared to some other bosses, which we're going to get to much later in the video. Moving on though, next is going to be the Looking Glass Knight from Dark Souls 2, and to be totally frank, like, he's just your basic sword and shield opponent, and I honestly don't feel as if it's one of the better ones. It's not super standout for that reason, although this fight is kind of like Renala from Elden Ring, where his most interesting property is he can actually spawn someone else into the fight. And if you're playing offline, it will be an NPC that he brings in, but if you're playing online, he can actually summon in real players to fight with him. And more importantly, the real players, given the right build, can actually heal the boss. This can be extremely frustrating and totally breaks the rules of engagement of Souls boss fights in general, and introducing a PvP element to what is otherwise a PvE-centered game and boss fight can get really, really messy. And so I'm not saying it's the best implementation here, nor is the Looking Glass Knight one of the best bosses ever, but it's very interesting and it's unique, and I think I have a lot of fun playing against it as well. I would describe the Looking Glass Knight as a slightly above average boss in Dark Souls. I think he has an amazing look and presentation as well, an unforgettable encounter, if you will. Staying with the theme of Dark Souls 2, next is the Flexile Sentry, which I know this is not the most complicated or difficult fight in the game, and it does appear as a mini-boss quite a lot here, and so if you know how to deal with it in its boss encounter, it becomes very easy later on. But the thing is, the Flexile Sentry is so cool. It has two different sides, and therefore weapons and movesets, and it can flip around and do different kinds of combos with those different sides, as well as having some very rare moves that only come out during very specific conditions. I feel like the amount of move mix-ups I've seen from the Flexile Sentry are, like, honestly champion Gundyr level, to be real. It's such an interesting boss that is very replayable, and I have a great time fighting him. What I don't have a great time with, however, is trekking through the goddamn Tomb of the Giants to get to a slightly above average boss, which is Gravelord Nito. And despite all the gankiness of this fight, I still think it's pretty fun and engaging, and I like the actual boss design a ton. It's one of the best visual bosses in Dark Souls 1, and I don't hate its mechanics either. It's kind of like just a slower moving sword opponent, but most of its damage output actually comes from its minions, and most of the distraction, what you have to deal with and why you can't just instantly delete this boss, is because you will get swarmed very quickly at basically all times during this fight. I do feel the actual fight in a bubble is consistently above average, but I have to dock points for the terrible area that it's in. It's really hard for me to separate the runbacks and or area that is associated with that boss with the actual fight itself, because I love Nito, but I hate the Tomb of the Giants. And that's the case for a few of these bosses we're going to get to, because I'm not exactly sure where to rank them otherwise. And speaking of which, let's go ahead and let's just get to it. I mean, oh, you all knew it was coming eventually. I mean, the war flashbacks just started, but the Smelter Demon and then the Blue Smelter Demon in the DLC, we're going to knock these two out at the same time, because it should be illegal. Like, whoever made this should go to jail to make a fight that's actually so good behind the worst runbacks in, like, all of Souls games. Both of them consistently have terrible runback routes. It's actually unbelievable how such a good fight, like a really high tier or top tier fight for Dark Souls 2, gets muddied because of the awful way to get back to it. It's just like, I cannot get over it. But the thing is, these demons are mostly the same in terms of their moveset, but they're a bit different in terms of range, I believe frame data, and most of the timings on their attacks as well. But otherwise, it's the same deal. You can't just like use the same approach against one or the other, because their timings are slightly different and will catch you off guard. Other than the good rhythm they have in their fight, if you get too close, they have fire that's burning in their bellies, so that you will passively take damage if you're too close. So it's a bit of a trade-off when you should actually go approach and punish, and when you should stay back and let them kind of cook and do their thing, literally. Outstanding boss design, but muddied by an absolutely pitiful and embarrassing runback system. Taking a pretty hard shift in tone and pace and direction is going to be Crossbreed Priscilla in Dark Souls 1, located inside the Painted World. She is the main boss of this area, but what's really interesting is you walk into this fight and nothing will happen unless you swing first and engage. Otherwise, she'll just stand there and give you dialogue. Once you do engage, she'll become invisible, and you can only hear her or just see little footprints walking around in the snow to know where she's at. And her moveset feels like it's kind of the version 1 of Sister Frida in Dark Souls 3 in that DLC, which we'll get to in a little bit, but it feels like, you know, very inspired off of Priscilla. I think she's a great boss, and despite the gimmick of turning invisible, which could be hella annoying if handled incorrectly, I think it's done fine here, and I actually quite like this fight from its unique presentation to its actual moveset. It's not a hard boss, you won't struggle on this one too much, but it is fun and entertaining, and I like how it's done. Next up, we've got Godric the Grafted from Elden Ring, a boss I really like. It's not even by a long shot the most powerful or the hardest boss in the game, but its placement is very interesting and important. Obviously, you know, in the lore, it's the weakest of the demigods, which makes sense why he's not the strongest thing ever. But, you know, lore reasons aside, his actual placement where he is in the game is excellent, because after Margit, I think is going to be a tough boss for most, you know, brand new players. And Godric is a bit of like a confidence boost, or it introduces a few new mechanics, but is easily defeated enough where you do feel like you're getting better at the game and you're actually improving. You can see that with each run you play of Godric, and I think it's genius. Not to mention, he gets a few different moves during phase 2, and this all keeps the fight fresh, fun, and interesting throughout the whole thing. Again, I can't say he's my favorite boss, nor is he even close to my favorite boss in Elden Ring in particular, but he is good. Like, it's a fair fight and it's fun. Sometimes it makes me wonder how different the reception of Elden Ring at launch could have been if Godric had been the opening boss instead of Margit. Who knows? It's an interesting thought experiment, but I do think Godric is a slightly above average boss, all things considered, in Souls games. Next is going to be a very different kind of boss, but one I still thoroughly enjoy nevertheless. It is a gimmick boss in the sense that you get a weapon specifically to do this fight. This is fighting against the Storm King in Demon Souls, this giant stingray that flies around the arena, and it has a couple of minions that you also need to take out with this. What I like is you're not just fighting the main bad guy, there's just enough smaller enemies flying around where you kind of have to, you know, multitask and deal with those too, and it's only vulnerable at certain windows. It flies sometimes out of range where you need to wait for another vulnerable window or opening before you can punish again. I love the presentation, the weapon's really fun, and obviously not an extremely difficult fight once again. Most of the bosses that give you a weapon in the arena to use very rarely are, but I feel this is a good version of doing that. And, you know, later, like this was Demon Souls, in later games, there's ones that I just don't feel quite live up to as well as Storm King did it. There is one more I think does it the best, but we haven't gotten to that yet. I think Storm King is a pretty above average boss in Demon Souls, despite it being a little bit, you know, unorthodox. So this next boss, I almost called him Dragon Slayer Ornstein, but then I remember nerds on Reddit were gonna be like, bro, it's not actually Ornstein, dude. He's just some guy wearing the armor. Shut up. I know, it's not exactly Ornstein, but it's, for all intents and purposes, the same kind of boss, just without the other part that makes that fight so unique and work as well as it does. Now, don't get me wrong, I think old Dragon Slayer does hold up on his own, just as a mechanical boss, which is more, it's less of a compliment to Dark Souls 2 and more to show the integrity and mechanics of the bosses in Dark Souls 1, actually. All you have to do is strafe right and win the game, but he's a fun boss nonetheless. So next is going to be a boss from Dark Souls 3, which I think is very solid, but not in the top of the lineup of that game. This is going to be Vort of the Boreal Valley, which is pretty much the first main boss you're going to fight after the tutorial boss of Udix Gundyr, and I think he's great, and he can be pretty damn dangerous. And the only things I really don't love about this boss are because of its placement in the game being so early on, I feel like introducing the frostbite mechanic in no other way really other than this kind of makes players confused. Like, I bet so many first-time players were getting beat up by Vort and getting hit by Frostbite, having absolutely no clue what it was actually doing to their character and how to counterplay it as well. But still, despite that, I think he's a very dynamic boss. I could even do without the Frostbite mechanic entirely, and I still think this fight would work on its own. He's a lot of fun, and I do see him as an above-average fight in general. I also feel his mechanics mirror Oseros, the Consumed King later in the game. They have very similar designs. I think Oseros is probably a little bit of a worse version. I think Vort is probably better, to be honest, but I still like both of them, and I think they're great. Moving on, we have the Divine Dragon from Sekiro. It's not the most mechanically complex of bosses, to be quite honest, but as far as its visuals and presentation go, that is what the point of it is. It is a story boss, but in a way that's done far more interesting. As compared to something like, Aldia or Moon Presence, them doing a story boss near the end of the game like this has such a grandiose feeling, and you can tell that this was like authored and curated to have this specific kind of look and feel. I love it. The gimmick is that you gotta wait for these trees to start sparking with lightning, and you gotta grab that one, throw it at the dragon, and then deal damage to it. It's a very simple premise, but because Sekiro has a plethora of mechanically intricate bosses, I think it's perfectly acceptable and fine to have more of a cinematic fight like Divine Dragon, and it's one of the best ones in all of Souls to me. Next up is a boss I'm a bit conflicted on, but I still do think overall I would consider an above average fight because it's trying to do something very different. Now, this is the Duke's Dear Freya from Dark Souls 2, and it is a little scuffed. It's a little bit of jank, to be honest. Like, it's not the most polished fight in the world. If it had a bit more polish, I think it has a lot of potential. I think that it's kind of like doing the Armor Spider concept, but without a lot of the moves that literally just force you to not play the game for a bit. This one, you can pretty much approach it in any way you want. If you're not holding a torch, then a lot of these smaller spiders will come after you, and I don't love forcing you to use an item really to make this fight easier, but overall, I would say that I really enjoy the concept of this one, and its execution with just a little bit more attention to detail, I think I would really, really thoroughly enjoy it. Next up, we've got a boss from the Dark Souls 1 DLC. This is going to be Sanctuary Guardian, so this is by far the easiest boss in the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, but I think it's meant to be. This is the opener right into, like, you literally walk 10 feet to a fog wall, and this is how the DLC opens. So I don't think they want to make this boss insanely oppressive just to basically lock people out of all of the actual really good bosses behind this, but I think it's, honestly a fun fight on its own. Sanctuary Guardian only has a handful of moves to deal with, so it's not like the steepest learning curve on a boss, but his moves come out insanely fast, and they can often combo into one another, so you have to be extremely careful. If you get clipped by one, obviously you might get hit by another 3 or 4, and then that could be the game, so you have to be still pretty careful. Okay, so for our next boss, I have a little bit of a theory I want to explain. Now, in the development of Dark Souls 2, they ended up with having too many levels and too many different bosses they just didn't know what to do with, and this was the first time in Souls we saw like a multi-boss final boss. So you have to fight the Throne Watcher and Defenders first, and then later you fight Nishandra. And so it's my theory that either probably like the Throne Watchers and Defenders could have been maybe concept for an actual final boss, but they had so many, they're like, we need to shove a few more in here. And so technically, if you do all of the true endings, you get Throne Watcher and Defender, followed by Nishandra, then followed by Aldia, Scholar of the First Sin. You have a 4 people boss fight at the end of this game. That's kind of ridiculous. But I do think the Throne Watcher and Defender are very good bosses. Not quite, an Ornstein and Smo duo level, but certainly better than, a Godskin duo. They're fine. I think they're very good, but they're not amazing. They do have healing properties, which can be a little bit tricky to deal with. And they tend to always make an offensive option and then immediately roll back afterwards. So if you just outspace their offense, you can catch them rolling backwards for huge damage because they usually don't act out of it after a while. They have very abusable AI, to say all that. And I think they're a lot of fun, but they're not awesome to me. All right, let's just get this one out of the way. We have to talk about it. Great Grey Wolf Sif is the saddest fight in all of Dark Souls. It actually got me crying in the club. She's just trying to protect her master's grave, and the saddest mechanic for them to ever develop is once her health is low, she'll just start limping around and actually really isn't able to throw out any moves. It's a bit of a freebie fight. I don't think it's actually going to be that difficult for most people, but I love its presentation, and it's a decent mechanical fight too. It's also very clearly the blueprints for other fights in Souls, like the Royal Rat Authority, even I would say the Champion's Grave Tender in Dark Souls 3, or like the Great Grey Wolf in that. It's very clearly like the moveset is based off of Sif originally in Dark Souls 1. Excellent fight and very sad as well. All right, moving on, we have Sin the Slumbering Dragon from the Dark Souls 2 DLC. Now, I'm going to be totally honest, I have never really been the biggest fan of this fight, although I can fully admit that it is one of the better dragon fights, especially compared to a lot of the ones in Dark Souls 2. Ancient Dragon in this is not even a contest, although there's a lot of things about Sin that I don't love. Particularly the mechanic where this stupid orange smoke breaks all of your equipment. So if your weapon is not particularly durable, you may end up going through multiple weapons to kill this thing for really no other reason other than to be annoying. His moveset is fine, his hitboxes might be a little bit on the jank side, but it does feel like progress to some extent. This is Fromsoftware kind of getting a handle on what makes dragon fights good. They're getting better at it. It's a bit of a smaller scale dragon, so it plays a bit nicer with the camera for the most part. I just don't love the mechanic of breaking your weapon durability. I feel like it has absolutely no reason to, be in this fight. It's just a nuisance. It's just annoying, and that definitely holds it back for me. Otherwise, it would be a pretty damn high tier fight in my opinion. It just doesn't quite get there for me in terms of its potential that it could have reached. Moving on to Bloodborne, we have Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos, which has, again, just like the one Reborn, one of the most interesting and cool presentations, and even the way that you find it, it's insane. She is by far one of the coolest looking bosses in any Souls game, period, but I cannot say her moveset or her actual fight is, anything really of note, other than it's split into 2 phases, in which phase 1, she can't really do anything at all. Phase 2, she gets a lot more dangerous and unpredictable, and so this, very chaotic energy really encapsulates what this boss is and, the tone that it's going for. It's definitely a better fight in Bloodborne, but not the best in terms of the other things it has to offer. But as far as base game goes, it's pretty good. So next, staying in the realm of unforgettable presentations and visuals, we have Estelle, Natural Born of the Void. Now, I'm going to talk about this fight specifically because there is another Estelle in a cave later on in Elden Ring, but this particular encounter when you're doing Renala's quest line is definitely the one to do because it's just so unforgettable. It feels like it's in the wrong game and certainly in the wrong world. Estelle's moveset can be a little bit difficult to deal with sometimes. Getting hit by its gravity slam can be absolutely devastating and infuriating. Estelle also has a habit of teleporting around the arena a lot, and the arenas are huge whichever encounter you're fighting it in. I love Estelle so much. I think it's very different. It's quite out of character for Elden Ring specifically. Like, Ebrietas still feels like it fits the theme and aesthetics of Bloodborne, but Estelle is kind of just like a different animal incredible, man. Regardless of how you feel about the fight in terms of its moves and mechanics, I still do think it's an unforgettable looking boss, and the encounter is something that will stick in your memory forever. Moving on to our next boss, we have the Ruined Sentinels from Dark Souls 2. Somehow, Fromsoftware managed to make a very ganky encounter not annoying or frustrating. I mean, this fight has 3 enemies, and on paper, that can be a recipe for complete disaster. But somehow, by the grace of all that is holy in this universe, they managed to make a fight that actually still feels fun and not overwhelming in terms of how many enemies are, on the field at once. I think that has to do with the actual, arena design. It's technically divided into 2 floors so that you can use verticality to separate them and maybe take them one-on-one, but also they have, virtually the same moves, so you don't actually have to change your timings for anything. Everything can be dodged the same way. I feel like this is a fight that honestly is simple, but its blueprint should be what they work off of if they want to make an encounter with multiple enemies that isn't frustrating or feels like it's unfair in any kind of way. I think it's actually great. Next up, fellas, we've got the Tower Knight from Demon Souls. It's virtually the same layout as the one reborn in Bloodborne, which we talked about, which amazing visual presentation. I don't think this one is quite as aesthetically pleasing as that, but I like the main boss a lot more. It's the same premise where you have these different, smaller adds and little enemies around that you need to take care of first. But the thing with the Tower Knight is the only way you're going to be dealing any kind of substantial damage is you need to knock it over, and you can accomplish that by smacking the back of its Achilles heels to where it falls over. And interestingly, when it falls over, it has a very devastating hitbox. So I think a lot of people probably got trolled their first time fighting this, where they feel like they got a knockdown only to immediately die right after. I like it, and I think it's an entertaining boss for what it's worth. The only real criticism I have is I could do without any of the smaller enemies around. I think they don't actually add anything to this fight. They're simply a nuisance and a bit of a chore to take care of before you start actually fighting the main boss, which is the same case with the one reborn. I could do without the witches all over the side in the peanut gallery, watching, but otherwise it's a fun fight. All right, so let's move over to Elden Ring and talk about everybody's favorite initial roadblock, Margit the Fell Omen. I feel like Margit was the face of the game for the first month when Elden Ring came out. Certainly there were cooler bosses in the game, but Margit was the one that everybody was talking about because it was a giant roadblock to have here in its placement. It's technically not a tutorial boss because there is one that serves that purpose before this, but for what it's worth, this is your first gloves off main encounter. Margit's timings on his moves are also deliberately designed to be a little bit off so that it catches bad rolling habits. It is literally designed to teach you that you cannot just spam the roll button and beat every boss in this game. I think this may be the best boss in early tutorial Souls games that are teaching you the basics of positioning, timings of rolling, and so on. And also he kind of does have a phase 2, so this boss has everything going on for it. It's a great blueprint for the rest of the game. I don't quite like him as much as his real counterpart, which we will get to in a bit, but it's an excellent fight and kind of brutal to have this early for a beginner player. But Margit gets definitely an A for me. He's an awesome boss. Moving over to Sekiro, pretty much a boss that's in the opposite position. It's not an early or tutorial boss. It's actually at the end of the game. And this is, you only encounter Emma the Gentle Blade when doing a very specific ending, which is, the Shura ending, basically the worst one in the game. Emma's fine. I don't think she's actually that difficult. She's easy enough to learn and intuitively respond to, I feel like, in your first couple of tries. But the thing that I cannot really get a grip on is that this boss is smaller than you, and that really changes the dynamic of Souls fights. Generally speaking, bosses are bigger than you because, well, number one, they're bosses and they're cooler that way, but also specifically in this kind of game, you need to be able to see what they're doing. And I feel like if you're just right on top of her the whole time, it's hard to see what moves are starting up, what's coming out. Sometimes you only know by the sound cues, and I think the actual physical design of this boss kind of holds it back a little bit. But otherwise, her moves are super fun to learn, and I think it's excellent. So big fan of Emma over here. Coincidentally, next we've got another final boss. This is Gwyn, Lord of Cinder from Dark Souls 1. Now, this fight mechanically is underwhelming, to be honest. He doesn't have that many moves, and most of them that he does have are pretty easy to dodge, and it's also completely cheesable if you parry. Obviously, a lot of people know this, but I think Gwyn, you know, a lot of people will say that there's a lore explanation why he's weak and why this fight sucks. It's not like amazing, but it's a decent enough final boss. For how old this game is, what they were capable of, you know, from a technology standpoint, and what they could actually pull off with software and everything at the time, it's still pretty impressive, and I like Gwyn. I don't love him. He's not, like, fantastic, but he's good. Gwyn is the iconic birthplace of so many memes. You know, you got Plin, Plon, you know what I'm saying? You got all that stuff. He's cool. He's fine. I like Gwyn. That's what I'm going to say about him. While we're on the topic of final bosses, let's talk about Nashandra. She has an amazing entrance. It's like crazy. I love the way that she is presented in this last encounter, and her mechanics are definitely different. She has these curse orbs that constantly, you know, exist and float around her to prevent you from approaching. You can destroy these, or you can bait her out of the range and she'll just make new ones. Now, the cool thing is, it feels like they made Nashandra a better boss later in the DLC. It's almost like they realized what they should have done with her and then made the boss that they envisioned from the start later on in paid content. I think I like her more than Gwyn, and there's not like a pathetic lore excuse for why her fight sucks. It's not mechanically amazing, but it isn't a joke necessarily either, and she can have some incredibly annoying mechanics that you really permanently take away your health and stuff, so that can be difficult to deal with. You kind of want to one and done this fight if you can. You don't want to spend any longer here than is necessary, but it's not the best final boss we've ever had, you know, that's for sure. But let's talk about the fight in the DLC that I feel Nashandra is probably trying to be. This is Alana the Squalid Queen, which I do think would have made a better final boss. She has almost the exact same mechanics as Nashandra, except she can summon an entirely whole-ass other main boss, plus, you know, little skeletons or other adds, and she can teleport around the room and stuff. I feel as if this would have made a more refined and grand experience for, you know, ending off Dark Souls 2. And a lot of people probably didn't play this fight, of all the people who played base game DS2 and never had the DLC. But this is like literally just an improvement on that prior boss. You could say it's recycled content, you could say it's refining the formula. Either way, I feel like this should have been in place of Nashandra, in my opinion. Next up, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be Deacons of the Deep from Dark Souls 3. So this archetype of fight where it's like you have something in the center that you need to damage and a bunch of other little mobs and enemies that are protecting it. As far as those fights go and the concepts of them, I think this is the best one for a couple of reasons. You can actually draw their aggression off of the main target. They have moves that will basically just outright kill you if you don't stop them, although that, you know, it has an incredibly telegraphed startup and you know it's happening. They do this whole like ritual, and they're just goofy guys in general. I really like Deacons of the Deep. I know it's not like the most awesome fight in the world or anything, but I can't lie and say that it's not a lot of fun. There's a lot to pay attention to, you know, a lot of micromanaging and multitasking. I can fully empathize with the fact that it's probably difficult to get this concept of a fight and this archetype that's not annoying or feels, you know, unfair or tedious. This fight, the best praise I can give it is it's not tedious at all. ROM and Phalanx to some degree can be, depending on, you know, what you're doing, but honestly, if you just want to like move them around and draw their aggression, you can basically do this however you want. You don't even have to kill any of the smaller enemies if you don't want, and you know, it's just a silly little fight. So now we are officially entering the realm of what I'm going to consider upper high tier or very good bosses. This is where it starts to get interesting because these are some of the more standout bosses for good reasons in Fromsoftware's catalog. And to begin, let's talk about the Man-Eater from Demon Souls, one of the first ever like duo gank fights in a Souls game period, and without a doubt very clearly inspired the Belfry Gargoyles, which we'll get to in a little bit. The only thing I don't particularly care for about these Man-Eaters compared to the Belfry Gargoyles, I think they work better with weapons. I don't love their charge attacks here necessarily, and their projectiles and range can be slightly frustrating to deal with. If you have a melee build, they can fly away and just become invulnerable to you for quite a while, and their AI is also, let's say, pretty easily exploitable, to be honest. Like, It's not the most polished fight in the game, even in the remake, in terms of how the AI behaves, but it's okay. And I also don't love the arena as much as, you know, a game later on with the Belfry Gargoyles. It's a little bit too skinny, and I think the pacing can be slightly awkward. But other than that, it's a very exceptionally balanced duo fight. Let's take a shift and move over to Dark Souls 3, the opening tutorial boss, the boy, my homie Udix Gundyr. I love this guy. He's an absolute legend. We play golf and we have dinner twice a month together, but in all seriousness, I think Udix Gundyr is awesome because he does so many things right. This is how you open a Souls game, in my opinion. I think Elden Ring did it very similarly with its opening boss, but not quite as good as Udix Gundyr. I also think that it shows you exploration is rewarded if you go and find the fire bombs, so this is a good tool for new players. But even if you're a veteran, this is a fight that, like, hey, this is what the game is going to be, get used to it. And for God's sake, it even has a second phase for the, like, you've played the game for 5 minutes at this point and you're already dealing with this giant abyss lizard that just comes out of the thing, you know. It's like, it's wild. I do feel Udix Gundyr is a near perfect tutorial boss for what the game is trying to show players. He's absolutely incredible. Coming back over to Dark Souls 2, we have Mytha the Baneful Queen. Not Mithra, that's a different girl entirely. Mytha the Baneful Queen is an excellent boss in Dark Souls 2 because the arena is more of a boss than anything else. So you walk in here, and unless you do the thing where you burn this metal pipe that drains the poison in here, you fight her in a poison pool that's just going to cause you to passively take damage. You can perfectly well do the fight like this, or you can drain it either way, but if you don't, she's going to passively recover HP from just existing in the pool. It makes this fight a little more interesting, it's kind of fun, and her design is excellent. I love the way she looks, and her moveset is pretty fantastic. I would say the hitboxes can be a little bit wonky at times, but otherwise, I think she is very fun. It could certainly do with a little more polish. I would like to see this concept for a fight redone in a more modern game. I think it could be one of the most memorable ones ever, and I feel like, I don't know, this is one of the fights that makes me think of Dark Souls 2. It's very memorable and quite distinct in its own way. Next up, we've got Dark Souls 3's, the classic himself, Aldrich, Devourer of the Gods. And I love almost everything about the fight. I like the arena it takes place in, and, you know, this is where you fought Ornstein and Smo so long ago. And I like his moves, too. The only thing I'm not a giant fan of is I don't think this boss plays well with the camera, and also the telegraphs for his moves and his startups can be a little weird. Other than that, I think he's pretty fun for the most part. He's one of the weaker bosses in Dark Souls 3, and by weaker, I don't mean actual power. I mean, like, compared to the lineup, I don't think he's one of the best designed. I understand his placement in the game and the role he serves, and I also do like the concept of him switching back and forth between two different magics. Another boss that I really like does that too. It makes for, you know, good visual presentation and adds a little bit of strategy to it as well. Aldrich is fun, not what I consider to be a god level boss, but very solid regardless. So next is a very interesting boss. This is the old hero from Demon Souls. It has one very specific gimmick, which is this boss is blind and cannot physically see you, but he can hear you move and can, you know, like, feel your presence. And so you have to be careful about how you move, where you position, and, you know, what windows you choose to punish. Also, there's a ring, I believe, that makes him a little bit less, you know, alert to your presence. You can kind of add a bit of stealth this way, and he's devastating if he knows where you are. He can be relentless in his attacks, and despite being a boss that quite literally cannot see you, he does insanely well at tracking your movements, which is really scary, and it adds so much tension to this fight. And I don't know, it's actually one of my favorite fights in Demon Souls. I wish they would play with this idea a little bit more, because I haven't really seen them, you know, work on this iteration for any other boss. Not that anything comes to mind, to be honest, but I think it's really great and very special for this game. Next up, we've got the Rotten from Dark Souls 2. There's nothing really intricate or, you know, crazy or complex going on with this boss. It's straightforward but effective. It's this giant glob of disgusting mess that has a huge cleaver. That's basically it. And his arena has a little bit of stage hazard stuff, like there's some fire in it, so you need to be a little careful about that. He has a few grab attacks that can catch you off guard, but otherwise, I just think he's a super straightforward and fun boss. Not trying to do too much, not overly complicated, just everything that makes a Souls boss interesting, and he has some decent mix-ups. I don't love the area he's found in, but I like him mechanically and visually, and his presentation is top-notch. It's stellar. Big fan of the Rotten over here, absolute lad, and gonna invite him to my wedding, honestly. All right, so let's get this fake-ass belfry gargoyles from DS2 out of here and talk about the real one. This is where it's meant to be experienced. The bell gargoyles in Dark Souls 1 is how this was balanced. The enemies are a little bit bigger in scale in terms of their size, but there's only 2 of them, and that's very deliberate because of the arena that it's put on. That's how it was meant to be played, and I think having slightly bigger yet less enemies makes this fight just play so much nicer. You can manipulate the enemies where, you know, one can start up an attack leaving it vulnerable, and then you can go and punish the other one for free. It's like there's a lot of strategy to this one. You can play it in a variety of ways. You can do some tail cutting to get weapons if you want to. It just baffles me how Dark Souls 2 looked at this and said, yeah, let's recreate it, and they got it so wrong. Like, it's just a testament to how well balanced this fight is. And as far as duos go, you know, in terms of passive and aggressive states, this should be the blueprint. It's like a nearly perfect fight to me. Taking a pretty hard jump in game, we have Elden Beast from Elden Ring, which is the final boss in the base game here. So Elden Beast is good, but it's not like perfect, and I can't say it's flawless. It's decent. The problem with Elden Beast, I think, is it was very clearly meant to have torrent playable in this fight. It was almost, you know, this amalgamation of quite literally throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this giant cosmic monster, and to not have torrent is kind of a crime here. Thematically, it would make a lot of sense, but even mechanically, the arena is just too big to navigate it on foot, especially with how much he teleports, leading to very awkward pacing during the fight. I don't think this was as polished as they wanted it to be, and I can understand why it was released in this way. It is a 2-parter with another boss we'll talk about later, which I like significantly more, but while it's passable, and I would even say very good, it isn't perfect or flawless, and there are certainly a few things I would change with Elden Beast, but it's a fun, like, spectacle to end the game on. You know, for sure, it's visually unforgettable. We can at least all agree on that, I think. Moving on, we have Dancer of the Boreal Valley from Dark Souls 3, which I feel is a very unique and unforgettable fight. It can actually be encountered a couple of different ways. You can fight this boss super early on in Dark Souls 3 if you do, you know, a very specific route, or you can fight her directly after Yorm the Giant. In any case, the Dancer has 2 separate swords and has a very dance-like rhythm to its moveset and its actual pace. It'll start swinging its swords to the rhythm of the music, and you need to pick your defensive options somewhat rhythmically as well. It's kind of like a Sekiro boss in some ways. I actually like, you could almost, with a couple of tweaks, drop Dancer into that game and nobody would be none the wiser. Like, it kind of works like that. So it feels different for Dark Souls 3 in a lot of ways, but it still works with its mechanics and what that game is going for. I think she's so much fun. So coming over to Dark Souls 2, we have Velstadt the Royal Aegis, which is kind of like the roadblock before what you really could consider entering the late game of DS2. This is like the final boss before you enter the last stage of the game. And in a lot of ways, when games do this, it's supposed to be a pretty damn hard checkpoint that, unless you're really prepared, you shouldn't be able to get past. Velstadt's great, but I don't think he's as powerful as he could be. They nerfed him to some degree, not like literally, but they could have made him have a bit more health, or maybe do a bit more damage, or maybe make his moves even slightly faster. He looks great, and I think he, you know, is an awesome concept. I just don't think he's quite as, like, scary as maybe he should be for this stage in the game. The arena doesn't necessarily complement this design either. I mean, these just tiny little pillars don't serve any function. Like, sometimes you can use pillars in fights to avoid bosses. You can use them tactically. They're so small here, they just get knocked over by him, and maybe it's just for visual sake, I don't know, but it may as well just be this open arena if you're gonna do that. I mean, it's fine just to knock over stuff or whatever, but it's a little lame once you realize the gimmick. Let's move on to our next boss, Dragon Slayer Armor from Dark Souls 3. Honestly, one of my favorites in the late game here. Now, this fight has something interesting happening at the same time. You have not only just this, you know, giant sword and shield boss that's very well designed, but you're also getting attacked from outside the arena. And you might might be tempted to say, God, that sounds terrible. Like, why would you even like this boss? It has a very smart tell where you can actually hear the startup of when these are coming, and this completely changes the game. If this were silent and you had to be looking around and, lock off the boss to be paying attention when these are coming in, I think it would completely ruin the fight and make it obnoxious. But its implementation was so smart, it's polished, it's well designed, and I think it's a ton of fun. Moving on to Martyr Ligarius from Bloodborne, this is not a mandatory boss. It's actually optional, and more so than that, it's in a secret area of the game that you really have to go out of your way to encounter. But that on top of, once you defeat Martyr Ligarius and you put on his crown, another secret area opens up to you. So just for the mystique and atmosphere and, intricacies alone, just with that stuff, he's already amazing. But I like his moveset a lot too, and he's a fun boss to learn. The only move I'm not a giant fan of is the flying swords that are just kind of a little obnoxious. I don't love those, but everything else I'm fine with. He's got a giant spear. It's so addicting trying to learn the parry timings of these. It's so satisfying to play. I actually really adore Martyr Ligarius. It's just kind of a shame that he's not a mandatory boss, because I feel, if people only played the bosses they need to, they missed out on something pretty great. He's excellent. All right, let's flip over to Elden Ring for a second and talk about what is Fromsoftware's to-date best weapon gimmick boss, in my opinion. You get the Great Serpent Hunter to fight Rykard, and my god, it's just so damn satisfying to use. This fight is just so much fun. That on top of the fact that it's two-phase, the mechanics are nothing to scoff at, even though it is a visual/atmospheric boss. The second phase is significantly more difficult to deal with because multiple moves can be happening at the same time as he summons stuff. Phase 1 can be tricky, but there's only one move in the opening phase that I dislike, and that is the ground slam move that is unavoidable damage. A lot of people said you can jump over it or you can roll through. I've never seen anybody actually dodge this move properly. I don't think it's avoidable whatsoever. So admittedly, that docks a few points from my ranking, but not enough to even take this out of upper high tier for me. It's such a delight fighting Rykard. I'll never get tired of it. Moving over to Sekiro for a moment, drawing an Elden Ring comparison, we're going to talk about Gyobu Masataka. I think this fight is basically the Margit equivalent in that game, where it's not exactly like the tutorial boss, it's not in the direct opening, but it is the first gloves-off bosses where it's hey, this is your gate checkpoint to the rest of the game. This fight introduces you to the mechanics that you are going to encounter throughout the rest of Sekiro, and this is your version 1 of dealing with that. Also, it's worth noting that he's not massively aggressive, and the reason for that, I think, is because, this is supposed to give you some breathing room to decide if you want to heal or if you want to, do something else or prepare your strategy for when he comes back. You couldn't have a massively aggressive boss in this place, otherwise I feel like it'd be too much for people. But getting the lessons down of blocking and parrying and even using grapple if he gets far away enough are all excellently conveyed. I think Gyobu is a super excellent tutorial fight, even though it's not an unofficial tutorial, if you want to put it that way. He's both the figurative and literal gatekeeper to the rest of what Sekiro offers. Staying on Sekiro for a moment, we have the final boss in the Shura ending, and this is where you fight Ishin. I would say this fight is extremely different to the true version of him. We'll get to that in a little bit, and this one's fine. I do still think it's an entertaining boss for the most part, but the reason it's hard is because there's two moves, the one mind move that is just insanely broken. That is the one that is just gonna make people be done with the game. Other than that, if he didn't have that move, this fight's not too bad. I think he's a lot of fun and is just simply a textbook example of a upper high tier boss. Up next is one of my favorite bosses in Dark Souls 2. The Lost Sinner, I think she is a ton of fun. I would say that there is a little bit going on here with this fight where you can make it a bit more challenging, so you can keep the room dark or you can light up the oil on either side of the arena to make it more bright in here. Honestly, it doesn't make that much of a difference in my opinion. As long as you can still see the moves winding up and what's punishable and stuff, it's not really that big of a deal. But it's your simple straightforward aggressive sword opponent. A couple of her moves can combo into each other, so you really don't want to get hit by anything if you can avoid it, and also she definitely punishes more passive play. I think the Lost Sinner is a textbook example of a Dark Souls 2 boss done right. This game doesn't have a lot of my favorite bosses, but this is up there for sure. So up next, we have the old Demon King from Dark Souls 3. which appears kind of as a mini boss earlier in the game before you encounter it in its main form here. Although I really do like this fight. I think it's excellent. It's your typical, like, you know, giant demon wielding a weapon, and it plays like that. It's actually inspired similarly to another boss we haven't gotten to yet from Dark Souls 1, and in that DLC, you probably know what I'm referring to. And this one definitely has some different moves, but is very clearly inspired off that blueprint. I can't say I like it as much as its original counterpart. I don't feel like its aggression is quite as intense. It doesn't have that breakneck pace like its original counterpart does, but despite all that, I really like the old Demon King, and I would consider him like upper high tier of all Souls games in general, and I like his arena quite a lot. You can maneuver in here and manipulate around specific moves in very interesting ways. It's a highly thought out fight, and I think they did an excellent job designing him. It's wonderful. Moving back to Dark Souls 1, I've been alluding to her for a lot of this video, and she's finally here. Chaos Witch Quelaag is one I've been wanting to talk about for a bit, because I think it's like what you want out of a Dark Souls boss in so many ways. Now, not including the run back, which I don't particularly love, the boss itself and its design, from its visuals, atmosphere, presentation, arena, and moveset are all excellent. You have the top half of her, which moves very gracefully and methodically and calculating, and then you have the spider that's kind of just moving around erratically, and both of their, you know, movesets respectively have very clear startups, and also you can tell what is happening if you pay attention to the animations. It's just like textbook how you design a good boss fight. Even if this wasn't a Souls boss, it would still work in general because it's just so well done. It's actually one of my favorite bosses to go and replay even to this day. You know, a lot of the Dark Souls 1 bosses can be a little bit more simple compared to, you know, the complexity of the bosses in more modern day games like a Sekiro or Elden Ring or something like that, but this one really does still hold up. I'm very pleased they used Quelaag as a blueprint for mini bosses in the series going forward, because they should. It's an excellent blueprint. There's literally like almost nothing wrong on paper that I can point at, other than the run back, to be honest. Like, that's the only thing that I'm not a giant fan of, but everything else is stellar. Moving over to Dark Souls 3, we have one of the most interesting fights in the game, the Abyss Watchers. So in the first phase, they sort of fight each other. Multiple Watchers spawn in and start fighting the main one, and you can approach this where you can be aggressive the whole time and just kill everything you see, or you can let them fight each other and wear out their health. Either way, once you get to the second phase, you have to fight the main one, who will, you know, basically restore or take the power from the fallen ones and use it for himself. He becomes a lot more buffed and a lot more aggressive as well. It's really about the moment-to-moment situation and picking the right either offensive or defensive option when the time is right. It's just like an awesome escalation of tension and mechanics, and the way the music heightens when you get to this stage of the boss fight is excellent. The Abyss Watchers are probably one of the most memorable fights in all of Souls, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, but how they managed to strike the balance between a good visual boss as well as an excellent mechanical boss cannot be understated. So now we're going to transition a little bit to our top tier slash like excellent, awesome, amazing bosses of the game. This is not the highest tier I have. These are bosses that are as good as they can possibly be without quite breaking into like the best of the best, the cream of the crop, the god level bosses in Souls, but everything that's just at that level but not quite there. Kicking us off for this part of our list, we have Black Dragon Calamite in Dark Souls 1. This is in the Artorias of the Abyss DLC. The way you access this fight is very interesting. You got to talk to a couple of NPCs, do a few different things. It's not as straightforward as finding his arena, but it's absolutely worth going out of your way to do so. I feel like this is the point where Fromsoftware kind of figured out how to make giant dragon fights like this that, number one, are fun in terms of their moves. It's got a great presentation, but they also play nice with the camera for the most part. It's not like incredibly irritating to track and get a hold of. You can keep it in frame for the most part and actually know what you're fighting, and you know what moves are happening, stuff like it's awesome. I think they really nailed it with this one. Admittedly, I will say the hitboxes aren't perfect. They are really not on Calamite, but that's okay. This is version 1 of what is the best dragon fight in Souls, which we haven't gotten to yet. But for a version 1, man, this is pretty solid. And for Dark Souls 1 specifically, this was really proof of concept for what they could do in the future. I think is very inspiring. Next is going to be the general himself, Star Scourge Radahn. Interestingly, this boss had to be nerfed very early on in Elden Ring's life cycle. Despite you also being able to summon tons and tons of NPCs to help you out in the fight, General Radahn had to be tuned a little bit. He has a couple of different phases, and it's not as simple as phase 1 and 2. He's got like phase 1.5 and then into phase 2, where he gets like a couple of different moves, but not enough to be like an entirely different phase. And then he actually has a real proper second phase, which he can control gravity magic, and he comes in with this meteor. This fight is crazy. Now, you can actually prevent this fight from entering phase 2 if you deal enough damage here and use your NPCs optimally early on. You can completely fight him solo as well. That's very viable. It's not too bad to do. He's not as bad of a solo fight as you might imagine. I think he looks a lot more threatening than he is now, especially after the nerf. If it's not Malenia, and if it's not Elden Beast or Radagon, I think Radahn is the face of Elden Ring when it comes to boss fights specifically. That's because of his insanely unique presentation, the visuals, the arena, everything about it. It's like a good cross between having a mechanical boss, but also being able to summon, because that's always been the conundrum, is like, okay, well, you can have a boss that's visually entertaining and maybe this grand spectacle, and maybe you even have summons integrated into it, but maybe it's not the most, like, actual entertaining experience and the most, vigorous fight. But Radahn, I think, really does strike that balance in a lot of ways. I would absolutely consider him a top tier boss of the series, no matter what. Moving on to Bloodborne again, we have Lawrence the First Vicar. This is in the DLC of Bloodborne, and you actually fight him in the exact same arena you fought Vicar Amelia in. And in a lot of ways, I think the fights are quite similar, and I think Lawrence is probably what Amelia should have been. There's not as much ambiguity with his animation and stuff, and he even kind of has a first and second phase. It's just a much more enjoyable fight to participate in my opinion. It's not a god tier boss, I can't say, but it is very, very solid. I don't have much to say about him because he kind of speaks for himself. If you've played against Lawrence, you know exactly like how this goes. To me, it's the beast archetype of fight in Bloodborne done at its best. This is its highest potential it can reach, and I think Lawrence really encapsulates that. Now we've got Lady Butterfly from Sekiro. So I've described there's a moment in every Sekiro player's life where the game clicked for you on your first playthrough, and you know what I mean if you've played the game, where all of the combat concepts snap into place. For me, Lady Butterfly was where that happened, and she is a very interesting boss on her own. There's a couple of different mechanics that make her very different to a lot of Sekiro bosses, namely that she can kind of jump in the air and, put herself invulnerable to you unless you shoot her down with like a shuriken or something. The only criticism I have for Lady Butterfly is actually leading up to her arena, you're set up to believe that her illusions that she makes in her second phase can only be defeated by using the snap seeds, and you only get one of them. It's a consumable. That is not the case. You don't even really need to engage with the illusions at all. Matter of fact, you can skip them in her fight, or more prevent them from spawning if you kind of just smother her and stay on top and do not let her push any buttons whatsoever. This was the boss that made me realize, okay, I actually need to take control. I need to stay aggressive, and I become the boss. Once you do that, you can end it very fast, and it's not nearly as intimidating as it seems at first. Playing passive or playing skittish or slow will just outright punish you and make this fight a brutal nightmare. I do feel like a lot of people also gave up on Lady Butterfly too, because if you manage to stumble your way through Gyobu, there's pretty much no way you're just gonna fumble your way through Lady Butterfly. And I think everything from her presentation to her mechanics are all excellently done. It's not my favorite boss in Sekiro because that's a pretty damn high order to fill, but I do think she's very, very good nevertheless. So coming back to Bloodborne for just a moment, this next one is going to be Murgo's Wet Nurse, which in some ways is a final boss, not including the stuff back at the Hunter's Dream. This is the last like real entity crazy boss that you fight out in the wild, and it does end on a bang. I really enjoy this fight. I love the arena. The soundtrack is eerily quiet. It's very strange and unsettling. That's probably the best way to put this in general, because this boss doesn't have a face. It's like this faceless cloak. All you hear is like a very faint nursery sound and chime, and then these blades whipping past your ear in the wind. It's like great design as far as like its actual mechanics and also its atmosphere Gundyr goes. At some point, the arena will go dark, and Murgo's wet nurse can also duplicate herself, and they're very hard to see. All you really need to do is run around to avoid the blades and, not try to be too aggressive, and you can avoid it just fine. But it's a very, very fun boss. I'm a giant fan of this one. And also, not to mention, when you kill this boss, instead of getting the prey slaughtered, you get Nightmare slain, which is just like an unforgettable moment. It only happens once in this game, but when it does, you'll remember that for the rest of your life. It's amazing. Next up is going to be Champion Gundyr from Dark Souls 3. Now, again, we talked about Udix earlier, and I love him so much. Like, he's an awesome boss, but this feels like what they wanted to do with the concept of Udix in general. And again, it's very similar to Asylum Demon, where it's like, you fight it in the tutorial, and it's fine. It's got a very limited move set, and it's not as powerful as it could be, but then you fight the Stray Demon later on, and it's at its full potential. This is like an anime where, you catch him at his prime, and, like, the showdown is incredible. This boss is, like, honestly, like, so sick. Champion Gundyr is very popular for people to do soul level 1 runs against because it's, like, textbook how you want to learn a fight. Its mix-ups and, like, combo potential is actually unmatched by almost anything in the game. It's one of the most, let's say, competent and also complex mechanical bosses ever. You might say it's kind of corny for them to reuse the same boss in the same area as the tutorial, but it's different enough to me where it justifies its existence. I have no problem with Champion Gundyr being in the game, and as much as I love Udix Gundyr and I think he's an awesome tutorial, this is the real fight for sure. I feel like it's been a while since we've had anything from Demon Souls, but this is going to be the Flame Lurker, which is a surprisingly amazing boss to me. It's very different compared to much of the lineup found in the game. Now, a lot of the earlier Souls games, Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, etc., the bosses are, generally slower paced than they are now. But I honestly feel like Flame Lurker belongs in something like Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring in terms of, like, the way its moveset and how aggressive it is. It appears totally out of place compared to the rest of the lineup in Demon Souls, which in its own way can have some charm to it, and it's actually one of my favorite fights in that entire game period. So Flame Lurker has to be a top tier for me. Not a god tier, and again, seems like it would fit better in something like DS3, but, who's to say for sure. This next boss is admittedly kind of a weird one, but still one that I like a lot, and this is King Vendrick in Dark Souls 2. So the way this fight works is you need to collect giant souls, which are obtained from defeating certain enemies and going into memories and collecting them. And his health pool, or his armor, is going to be entirely determined by how many giant souls that you have on you. If you have none, you're basically never killing him. If you have all of them, I believe it kind of cuts his armor/health in half, making it a lot more reasonable to fight. As for him, he's basically a giant cannon. He will almost one-shot you with virtually any move, and you need to kind of stick around to deal damage to him because obviously he has a ton of health or armor depending on the giant souls. I do find this insistence that Dark Souls 2 had where, like, some of the bosses have a prerequisite you need to meet before you can actually fight or deal damage to the boss to be a little irritating, but Vendrick's isn't too bad, to be honest. There's been far worse examples. He's very different, at least, to say something positive, and I actually quite like fighting him whenever I do play Dark Souls 2, which is not very often. Next up, we have the Penetrator from Demon Souls, which is also what they used to call me in college. Now, admittedly, the Penetrator, compared to, like, sword opponents we have now in modern-day Souls games, is very simple. He's got, like, 2 or 3 different moves, and each variation of them. There's not much mix-up potential going on here, although if you do get clipped by any move, it's big damage, and you will likely die. I would say that despite being very simple compared to a lot of bosses we have these days, it's still fun. I really liked fighting him, and it's very entertaining. Not an incredible, like, steep learning curve by any means. You can pretty much download it on your first encounter. That doesn't mean, however, it's not an enjoyable experience, and it's also just fundamentally a good design for a boss. Again, this is also the blueprints of what so many boss battles now we have in modern-day Souls games have been based off of. The simplicity was key here in getting the design correct. Up next, we're going to Elden Ring, and this is going to be Morgott the Omen King, which, again, so let's talk about that concept, like the Asylum Demon becoming the Stray Demon, or Udix Gundyr becoming Champion Gundyr. The same case could be made for Margit, and then turning into Morgott the Omen King. This boss is very different to Margit in a lot of ways, where it feels as if he's reaching his full potential. This is gloves off, and everything is on the table here. He has similar properties to Margit, where he uses the exact same weapons, although a little bit more lethal this time. Also, his timings can be a little bit off, similarly to how they were in that original fight. And also, I would say that his combo game is a little too much to what I consider to be perfectly balanced. I think this boss could be a little better if his combo game didn't feel like it was from a totally different game. Honestly, it feels like a Sekiro boss sometimes. Morgott is a certified masher. He just does not stop pushing buttons, and besides that, it's my only real gripe with the fight. Other than that, I think he's generally excellent. So after that, we have a boss in Dark Souls 3 that I really enjoy in the DLC. It's not my favorite in that because, damn, the DLC for Dark Souls 3 is a high bar. You know, we'll just put it like that. But anyways, the Demon in Prince, the Demon in Pain, and From Below. This is like a three-parter boss where you have a duo at the beginning that kind of take a page out of the Book of Ornstein and Smough, where depending on who you kill first will kind of change your strategy. And then the Demon Prince becomes, you know, like the main Giga boss. It's not a fight that most people are going to speed through or really melt because they all have a lot of health. This fight is a lot more of an endurance. It's about picking your windows, reserving your resources, and being safe. Not really something you want to speed through or even attempt to, because doing so will probably make you to make more mistakes and burn your precious resources. But it's a fight that is incredibly entertaining. It's a battle I will never forget and is easily one of the best fights in Dark Souls 3, period. So coming up next is a very special fight, at least to me anyways. It's not a DLC, it's in the base game. This is going to be the Shadows of Yharnam from Bloodborne. So what makes this fight so interesting, you might ask? At least to me, I feel like what this has going on is the fact that, like, it's a gank fight that's not only balanced because they have damn near perfect aggressive and passive states for each one of them, but they also kind of have a phase 2 or like a comeback mechanic when they get low health, but also it's a way to do a gank fight that's actually fun. It's so good trying to learn the parry timings of all of these, and you know, there's one that's like a lot more aggressive with the sword, and there's one that uses magic and stays back a little bit. Admittedly, when they start using their snake moves, I don't love the whip that they get. That's like incredibly long range and kind of like hard to see where it is and react to. I'm not in love with that move, and I think without that, the fight would still work, and it would play a lot better for it. But also, I feel this is one of the most replayable boss fights in Souls, period, and because it can go a variety of different ways, and like just the replayability factor is kind of unmatched. You can approach it very differently depending on who you kill first. It totally alters the dynamic of the rest of the fight and so on. Like, it's awesome. I actually couldn't give enough praise to the Shadows of Yharnam. The only slight criticism I might have is I feel the arena's a bit cluttery and there's just too much in the middle that you can get stuck on, you can get trapped on, especially when you're trying to maneuver around 3 different opponents. That can be tricky business. So if the arena was a bit more clean and maybe the, you know, level design doesn't trip you up as much, it might go a bit smoother. But that's like me really digging at the bottom of the barrel for something to complain about, because otherwise I love this fight so much. It's amazing. Up next is a very hidden secret boss in Dark Souls 2, and it's kind of a pain in the ass to access and get to. Very costly on your resources, and you cannot run back very easily if you die. So if you're going to approach the Dark Lurker, you probably should beat it on your first try, otherwise your life is going to be a nightmare. But I think it's one of the best bosses in Dark Souls 2, which is such a shame because it's hidden behind like some of the worst mechanics ever. Dark Lurker can also replicate itself and will do throughout the fight, so you have to deal with 2 of these very dangerous enemies. It's just the only thing I hate about this fight is getting back to it. Otherwise, I have like a ton of fun playing it, and I would do it more if it didn't cost me 40 years of my life to get back into the arena. My grandkids are going to graduate college before I can get back into the arena after accidentally dying to Dark Lurker. Such a shame because it's an awesome fight from an atmosphere, visual, and mechanical perspective, for real. Alright, so let's talk about a very special boss. This is the Demon of Hatred from Sekiro. Now, I do feel this boss gets, you know, unfairly contextualized, or it gets categorized wrong. A lot of people say this is what would happen if you take a Dark Souls boss and just put it into Sekiro. But I fundamentally disagree with that analysis for a couple of reasons. I think it's fair to say that, like, the beast fights in Bloodborne, you know, don't necessarily gel that well with the game's overall mechanics, but I cannot say the same for the Demon of Hatred. And the reason for that is you use almost every combat fundamental mechanic to fight the Demon of Hatred, and the more you're proficient with them, the more you can take care of it. Obviously, the reason people draw like Souls boss comparisons is because you're not exactly trying to parry this one. You don't even really need to take down its posture meter. It's very unlikely that you beat the Demon of Hatred through posture breaks. You're more than likely going to wear it at its health, which is probably why that comparison gets made, and I can understand that. But all things considered, I think the Demon of Hatred actually is a boss that's integrated almost perfectly with the mechanics that Sekiro is going for, and I'm very impressed they managed to pull that off. Also, this fight is not a sprint either. It is certainly a marathon where even if you push your aggression as much as you possibly can, you still got to wear away at 3 death blow marks in a pretty giant health bar. So it's not a quick encounter by any means. It's not a lady butterfly exactly. However, I still very much enjoy the Demon of Hatred, and I would be lying to you if I didn't say he was like a top tier boss in all of Souls, period. Going over to Elden Ring for a second, this is going to be Dragon Lord Placidusax. So I also feel that this is Fromsoftware really understanding the fundamentals and basics of what makes dragon fights work. I think they're really getting a grasp on it here. Surprisingly, I can't say it's necessarily my favorite dragon. There's one other that it shares that spot with. It's a very, very close competition. And if it's not my favorite dragon fight, it's like very nearly there. Placidusax is easily the best dragon fight in Elden Ring specifically, and it has some unforgettable moves. From an atmosphere and visual perspective, the presentation is unmatched. It's a secret arena, like you can't get better than this. And its nuke move, where it basically explodes the whole arena, the music drops out to silent for when it happens. This boss can also disappear and teleport around the arena and attack you. There's a lot going on with Placidusax. It's not just like a normal dragon that you can get under and smack to death. It has a lot of moves that cover its like ground level, and if you're being close and doing melee stuff, you're still not safe. It's a boss you got to pay attention to the whole time. The battle cannot really be done very quickly as it has a ton of health, so it's everything I love in a dragon fight, and really I hope they continue to prove on this formula in the future. Easily the best dragon in Elden Ring, flat out. Now this is going to take us over to Old King Allant from Demon's Souls, which is not only the final boss in the game, but it's also the final boss from Demon's Souls on my list. I wouldn't think it's super controversial to say that Old King Allant is like the best moment-to-moment fight in Demon's Souls. He has the most intricate moveset compared to a lot of the fights of his archetype. Now, while yes, compared to any other more modern-day Souls game, Old King Allant still seems very simple, but I really feel he's simple yet effective. Old King Allant is definitely more of a quaint boss, especially to end your game off of, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem for the context of this game, considering the rest of the lineup that appears in its roster. I think Old King Allant is like stunning from a visual perspective, his mechanics are super fun, and his arena is unforgettable as well. I have almost nothing negative to say about it other than, yeah, sure, maybe it's a little simple, but that's about it. And I would venture so far to say that Gehrman the First Hunter from Bloodborne is very similar to the design philosophies that make Old King Allant so good. This is the last boss in Bloodborne if you didn't do the specific ending that includes Moon Presence, and Gehrman tests every single lesson that you've learned in Bloodborne thus far, and even despite knowing all those lessons, he's gonna really put him to the test. I think he's a ton of fun. Gehrman gets much more dangerous when his health is low, and he moves so quickly and so erratically that he can be very hard to predict, and he has a super intimidating presence just based on his speed alone. He can kind of match you. You know, you're used to, being a hunter and being super quick, most faster than every other boss, but Gehrman matches you, and it's crazy. Next, we have one of my favorite fights in the Dark Souls 2 DLC. Unfortunately, it's hidden by, again, possibly one of the worst runbacks that has ever been invented by a human being. Somebody who genuinely is a masochist and enjoys torture will thoroughly enjoy walking to Sir Alon than they will fighting him. But I feel this is one of the standouts in Dark Souls 2. They definitely got it together a little bit more with the DLC. I wish this could have been in the base game because it's one of my favorite fights in general. It's got such a cool rhythm to it, but a neat little detail: if you beat this boss completely without getting hit, he will commit seppuku at the end, and it's an animation you only get by doing it flawless, which is really cool. I feel like we don't see that a whole lot these days. Moving back over to Elden Ring, we have another excellent fight. This is going to be Mohg, Lord of Blood, and it's so good. Now, I feel the people who dislike this fight may not enjoy it for very valid reasons. Specifically the mechanic where he steals your life and replenishes his own in phase 2, and basically outright killing you unless you have the thing in the flask that prevents your health from draining too much. That's fair, and I'm honestly not in love with that mechanic either. You know, forcing a very specific item in order to not get deleted in the boss fight, it's not my favorite thing in the world either. But in any case, I still think his mechanics, his presentation, arena, and atmosphere more than makes up for it. It also is technically an optional boss in Elden Ring. It is one of the remembrances, so I feel it's worth doing, even though it isn't one that you know, have to fight on a mandatory basis. I love Moak. I think he's great, man, and I'll play this fight any day of the week. Staying with Elden Ring here, we next have probably the face of the game, or otherwise the most iconic boss in Elden Ring, what is generally regarded as the hardest fight in this game period. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is absolutely no joke. Now, the only reason I'm going to give Malenia top tier instead of god tier, that's because I still to this day feel that Fromsoftware went a little bit too far with her design. I understand wanting to make an insanely hard boss, but to me, giving her both lifesteal and Octaslash, aka Waterfowl Dance, I just feel is a bit over the top. I understand you have a lot of tools in Elden Ring to deal with those things, but in terms of fair boss design that doesn't break the rules of its own game, Malenia cannot say that she actually, you know, fits in that mold. This breaks the rules of every single, you know, boss and what they're allowed to do or should be allowed to do, and I think that it's a little much in some areas. I've always been of the opinion that Malenia would be fair if they gave her just Waterfowl Dance or just Lifesteal. Giving her both is just simply over the top, and also the fact that, like, shielding her moves still grants her life back. Even if you don't lose anything, she still will retain some HP, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I know it sounds like I'm just negative about Malenia, but that's not really the case. I'm simply highlighting the very few flaws that she does have, because they are big ones, unfortunately, but everything else, like literally every single move, all of the aspects of her design, atmosphere, and her arena are genuinely perfect. So there's a little bit that keeps her out of god tier, but still it's like just falls a tad bit short of it to me. So let's take a bit of a shift in direction and go to the Dark Souls 1 DLC with Manus, Father of the Abyss. Now, when we were talking about the old Demon King a while ago from Dark Souls 3, that was very clearly inspired from Manus. The difference is, and it's very interesting because Dark Souls 3's combat is, generally speaking, a lot more fast-paced. However, Manus is more akin to a Dark Souls 3 kind of combat pacing than Old Demon King is. I almost think that they should be switched. Old Demon King should be in Dark Souls 1, and Manus should be in Dark Souls 3, because it's so aggressive. He works at a breakneck pace and does not stop. His moves are super fast and devastating, and it's an amazing battle. He'll do this thing where he retreats into the dark, and you can only see like the red glowing dots on the top of his like crown and horns, and you may not have any idea what move is starting up or what he's actually cooking, and it just feels like he moves way faster than he should be able to. That's partly what makes this fight entertaining and fun, however. Again, for these demon fights, I kind of wish they kept the very aggressive breakneck pace for all of those, because something about Manus's rhythm just doesn't get matched by any of these other demons they've developed so far. So now we are officially entering the god tier bosses. These are what I consider to be the top selection of Fromsoftware's catalog, battles that are almost flawless, and ones that I think certainly should be used as like the selling points and what they develop bosses from here on out afterwards. And to start us off here, we're going to talk about Sister Frieda from Dark Souls 3. This is in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC. The thing is, this fight has 3 very unique phases. You fight her in her just normal human form at first, and she's very similar to Crossbreed Priscilla, where she'll go invisible and then, you know, reappear using her scythe. In phase 2, Father Ariandel joins the battle, and he'll start swinging this giant pot around that will, you know, pour flames all over the battlefield, so it creates some stage hazard stuff, and you also have to kill and deal with both of them now. And then after killing both of them, it's still not over. The marathon has only begun. She turns into Black Flame Sister Frieda, and this is where she's at her most lethal and dangerous, and the rhythm of fight completely changes once again. It's got a very specific rhythm in the first phase, changes completely in phase 2, introduces some, you know, new dynamics, and then phase 3 is another switch up. Like, you have to be on your toes the whole time. Easily regarded as one of the best fights in Souls games, and seriously one of the best in Dark Souls 3. Like, it's damn near flawless. I cannot think of anything in particular that I feel is like bullshit about this fight or that I would change, and to me at least, it completely compensates for an otherwise somewhat lackluster DLC pack. I don't love Ashes of Ariandel in terms of like level design and even the other bosses, but Sister Frieda completely carries, and without it, it would be kind of a trash expansion pack, if I'm being honest. So thank God this boss is here. All right, next boss we gotta talk about is the fella himself, Father Gascoigne, aka Papa G, aka Big Pimpin', aka there's too many names for him. Father Gascoigne is the GOAT, and I know is a very early game boss, but that doesn't change the fact to me that it's like one of the most perfectly designed bosses that I feel have ever been created for so many reasons, not only in the context of Bloodborne, but of video games in general. And there's a neat little trick where if you're struggling with this boss, there's an item, you know, it's a little toy from his child that will distract him in the fight that can make this a lot easier if you're having trouble dealing with it. Otherwise, it teaches you all the lessons that you need to know about Bloodborne, period. Like, it arms you with the knowledge of everything that you need to be supplied with, and the way it's executed is genuinely flawless. He kind of has 3 phases, his initial form, and then he gets his like axe that he kind of takes out in phase 1.5, and then in the actual real phase 2, he turns into the beast, and then you learn how to deal with a completely different enemy on the fly. You have to adapt to a totally different playstyle, and while yes, technically the beast still is parryable and you can employ a lot of the same tactics, it is a very different pace switch up, and will definitely catch a lot of new and first-time players off guard when, you know, playing the game. So I think Father Gascoigne is like honestly top notch. I can't think of really a better tutorial boss than him. He's excellent. So moving back over to Elden Ring is a fight that's really grown on me lately, and when Elden Ring first came out, I wasn't the biggest fan, and I can't say that it's flawless. There's a few gripes that I have, but overall the good certainly outweighs the bad. Godfrey First Elden Lord is a very enjoyable fight. Now I will say there are 2 things that hold it back specifically. Number 1, I feel the switch up to Hoaraloo is at a weird time. It's not at the halfway point like a lot of phase 2s open up at. It's kind of like when you get him to, you know, 30% health more or less. It's not exactly the halfway point, so it feels kind of weird for that. I love Godfrey's moveset so much more than Hoaraloo's. I just don't have nearly as much fun fighting him in his second phase. I don't know what it is. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I hate grab moves in Souls games, particularly when bosses use them a lot. In Hoaraloo, his entire game plan is based around getting grabs, and like that stuff is just infuriating to me. I would rather fight Godfrey's axe and weapon all day every day than deal with Hoaraloo rushdown grab moves. It's just not really my favorite, but otherwise the boss is like actually perfect. Furthermore, last thing I would say is it feels a little bit strange going to this arena again. This is like the 3rd time you fought here at this point, but regardless, I'm just finding things to complain about at this point because there really isn't much other flaws to speak of other than okay, so next we're going to shift gears a little bit and head over to Sekiro with the true corrupted monk. And this, you know, we talked about the original corrupted monk quite a while ago, and while I really enjoy that fight, I feel this one is far superior because not only does it have just a lot more health, there's more death blow markers, it has a bit of more of an expanded moveset. The only thing I'm not in love with, honestly, is the arena. I feel it's a little too skinny, and I don't think it necessarily complements the aggressive and like mobile nature of the corrupted monk all that much. Otherwise, since it now has 3 death blow dots instead of 1, you have 3 separate phases. The second one can be skipped by landing a sneak death blow off the tree that's inside the arena. Still don't know if this was intentional or not. Apparently you could do 2 death blow markers, but they patched one of them, so it does seem like this one is intentional. Either way though, the true corrupted monk is no pushover, and it was one of my favorite experiences in gaming learning exactly how to deal with this boss, because I didn't feel like I got the full experience from the normal corrupted monk, as you can just get through it by, you know, spamming it with lapis and stuff and wearing down its health. This one, you don't really have that option as much, so you're forced to learn its moves and its rhythms and its patterns. One of my favorite experiences ever in video games, and I'll always remember it. Heading back over to Elden Ring for a second, let's talk about Beast Clergyman and Malekith the Black Blade. Honestly, some of my personal favorites. I think maybe I'm a bit biased, but I cannot help but love both phases of this. Technically, it's the same boss, obviously, and Beast Clergyman is significantly easier to deal with than Malekith because he just gets absolutely OP and broken in terms of his actual properties in his second phase. But Beast Clergyman is no pushover either. He's extremely aggressive and plays a lot more rushdown, where Malekith kind of plays more acrobatic and uses the arena to his advantage. Now, the thing is, Malekith is a hard boss, just objectively speaking. I understand you can learn the moves and you know, get good and all that, like, sure, but also it's definitely meant to be a lot harder than most of Elden Ring's catalog. They even give you an item in the game called the Blasphemous Claw if you're really having a hard time. It's a hidden in the sewers in another area of the game that actually lets you parry his Death Blade. That item single-handedly makes this encounter a walk in the park. Now, what's so scary about his sword is that it has a health-draining effect, and it actually caps the max HP you can have temporarily. So this is an extremely, you know, deadly and dangerous combo, hence the Death Blade. Like, it's actually insane. Also, his moveset can be incredibly acrobatic, meaning if you're playing a melee build, it's not always, you know, in your option just to go and punish him. You can't camp underneath him or anything. He flips around the arena a lot and even throws some projectiles, as well as some big area of effect attacks. So he's pretty much got it all. And again, objectively a hard boss compared to the rest of Elden Ring's lineup. His placement in the game is brilliant. He is essentially the lock before the late game. And again, personally, I would put him in my favorite top 10 bosses of Souls games ever. So I was trying to decide where to put him, but I think I ultimately landed on Soul of Cinder being in the God tier level. And now, while he's not my favorite fight in, you know, of all of Dark Souls 3 or, you know, even of Souls games, he's very, very excellent. And when it comes to the Dark Souls trilogy specifically, I think without a shadow of a doubt, he's the best final boss in terms of the base game. He's better than Gwyn, he's far better than Nishandra, he even emulates a lot of those properties from those older games and older bosses. His moveset is supposed to be like the amalgamation of all of the different, you know, popular equipment and weapons and playstyles. This means the Soul of Cinder has access to virtually every single weapon or like property ever. It can passively heal, it can buff itself, it has a second life, which is not, it's less of a phase 2, it's more just like, hey, I'm coming back, but I'm literally better this time. But with this huge variety of moves and abilities he has, I think it all leads to the fact that this fight never becomes repetitive or boring, despite playing very similarly to other bosses in the past. He has a lot of Gwyn's moves from Dark Souls 1, so despite the reuse, still manages to feel fresh and interesting, and it keeps it engaging. I'm a huge fan of Soul of Cinder. While I would have put it maybe somewhere in possibly top tier and maybe not God for a couple of reasons, I think this boss could actually do with being even a little bit harder than it is. When all is said and done, it makes me realize that Soul of Cinder is the proper way to end the Dark Souls trilogy specifically. It's an unforgettable moment, and you'll always remember the first time that you actually defeated him. Alright, so let's move on back over to Sekiro and talk about Great Shinobi Al. Now, you will fight this boss if you do any other ending other than Shura, and this is what happens immediately after if you choose to serve Al or choose to serve Kuro. So, in any case, technically you do fight Al twice throughout the game, but we're going to get to the other encounter later. The Great Shinobi version is him using a little bit more of his cheap and underhanded tactics compared to his other battle, but that doesn't mean he's a pushover whatsoever. The thing is, he uses a lot of tactics like smoke that prevents you from healing. He'll also throw poison. Not to talk about story or lore too much, but Al is very avoidant and he's kind of a coward, hence him always jumping back after attacks. And when he does this, you can absolutely punish everything he does after because nothing has armor for that. In fact, you're actually encouraged to rush him down whenever he does that move where he backs up. When he cowers in fear, you have to be extra aggressive and not cower away as he does. It's a storytelling moment that's very indicative of his character that also makes a lot of sense from a gameplay perspective, and it's just good design fundamentally. As soon as you take away the first death blow mark, he's going to get on his knees and beg for his life. This, however, is a trick, it's a scam, he's lying to you, and you need to continue to attack in order to initiate this phase 2 and start off in an advantaged state. In this phase 2, he actually acts a little bit different. He employs poison and plays basically even more more aggressive. The interesting thing about Owl as a character is he can do essentially anything that you can do. He has access to your sword, your tools, and a bunch of like equipment that you might bring into a boss. And it really gives you the feeling that in some sense he is trying to cheese you. You are the boss in this. You have the giant health bar, and he's trying to do everything he can to take you down by any means necessary. So it feels good to have a bit of a perspective change to some extent, and it's one of my favorite bosses in all of Souls games, not only for its visuals, its storytelling, its actual mechanics, like everything about it is actually perfect. Moving on to Dark Souls 1, once again, we have Ornstein and Smo. Do I need to say anything that hasn't already been said about these two goats? It's, I think, easily the best fight in all of base game Dark Souls 1. It's genuinely, without a shadow of a doubt, pitch perfect. It's what the Godskin duo wish they could be. So what makes Ornstein and Smo so interesting? Well, you have that dynamic of, you know, one big fat lad and one smaller one that a lot of video games do as a typical duo fight. They also have nearly perfect passive and aggressive states where they don't feel overwhelming, and they also don't feel like too much of a pushover either. That on top of, depending on who you kill first, either Ornstein or Smo, they will adopt the other one's soul into their own moveset, and it will completely change the dynamic and route of the fight. So this is extremely replayable. It can go a variety of ways, and I think it never gets old. It's like perfectly balanced. I say perfectly balanced with a few caveats. Obviously, some of Ornstein's like insta-teleport moves are kind of jank. There's some weird and wonky hitboxes. A lot of technical stuff that probably could be sorted out in a more modern-day Souls game. For what this is, though, specifically, I still think it manages to make its way into God tier. It's absolutely legendary, and I feel it would be a crime against humanity if I didn't put the good old ONS inside of GOAT. Heading back over to Dark Souls 3, we have one of the most iconic fights in all of the game. This is going to be Dark Eater Midir, and it's interesting because the reason I'm going to rank Midir as the best dragon fight in all of Souls, even over Placidusax, is, yes, you know, Placidusax is a lot more grand scale and epic. He's got more moves and so on. He's probably even more dangerous, but I think Midir is a better experience. I would describe Placidusax as a lot more of a passive boss that just has like giant, ridiculous one-shot moves, and Midir has a few of those too, like some actual unbelievable stuff. Don't get me wrong, they are very similar bosses in terms of their moves and framework, but I really like how Midir is a lot more of an active boss. Placidusax, the height of its movement really is when it teleports and then flies around the arena, kind of breaking the pace and flow of the fight. I think if Midir just got up and flew around a lot, then it would kind of destroy the pace that this is going for as well. Otherwise, I think Midir is like the quintessential dragon fight in Souls. I don't know if they've ever really made an experience that has surpassed this yet, and who knows if they ever will. I think it's very, very difficult to get a dragon fight correct, especially in a Souls game where it's got to play nice with the camera and all that, but Midir thankfully covers all of its bases, and it's a ton of fun, visually stunning, atmospheric as hell, and it's incredible. Getting to the bosses that are highest on my list, this next one is going to be the infamous Orphan of Kos from Bloodborne. So this boss is quite controversial. It's a battle that many people have many strong opinions on, and myself included. I think Kos is not quite the best designed of the DLC, which we'll get to, but it is certainly the hardest. The only downside that I have to this fight really, or the only major criticism, is its arena is honestly not well telegraphed, because you can walk in the water a lot. Like, you can go pretty far out there, but it's not told to the player whatsoever. It's very bad conveyance. And the thing is, in general, water in Souls games has always meant death. You are naturally not inclined to go towards that area of the map, even though you can, and it's kind of necessary because you need a lot of space and room to effectively fight Orphan of Kos. I genuinely think if they just made a slight part in the cutscene where he walks in the water a bit to show you that maybe that's possible, this would be a lot more tolerable, because trying to fight it at the top of the beach, honestly, you're making it a lot harder on yourself than it really needs to be, unless you just go and fight in the open water. It's so much better. But otherwise, Orphan of Kos has a second phase switch up that's very brutal and challenging to deal with. Easily one of the hardest bosses in all of video games, period. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as for our final boss ever in Dark Souls 1, this is going to be Knight Artorias of the DLC. This is by far my favorite boss fight in Dark Souls 1. They made a sword boss that's aggressive and challenging enough, and even has some interesting mechanics that you can exploit throughout the battle. Eventually, Knight Artorias will stop to try and buff himself, and if you do, it can get out of hand really fast because he takes less damage and he deals a lot more, so you want to prevent this. You can do this by either throwing things at him or just going and rushing up and catching the startup as he attempts to buff. It's so much fun because it really makes you think about each decision you make. You cannot mash during this fight. Every single action you take needs to be very deliberate, and again, while Artorias isn't necessarily a difficult fight by today's standards, he's still no pushover. I mean, compared to the rest of the roster on Dark Souls 1, they tend to be a little bit easier. Knight Artorias stomps all of them out completely, even still, and it's very clear that the design philosophy when making Knight Artorias really influenced almost every single one of the, let's say, traditionally good Souls bosses from there on out. He's absolutely excellent, and I would say damn near perfect. Alright, so, you know, it's not a crazy DLC or special boss or anything, it's just a base game Dark Souls 3 boss, but you already know the vibes. Pontiff Sulyvahn is easily one of the greatest Dark Souls bosses in every category. It's challenging to a variety of playstyles and builds. He'll duplicate himself throughout the fight, so you have an entirely different entity to deal with that completely changes the dynamic. The moveset is perfect. The music's insane. Like what can I say about the GOAT that hasn't already been said? It's just so good. It's like, I think that it's a nightmare. They really didn't have to cook like this for a base game Souls boss. Just in the middle of, it's not even like it's not even the final boss. It's just in the middle of the game. It's so out of place. There's no reason going as hard as it does. But we all love Pontiff. He's, you know, an actual legend. Coming back over to Bloodborne for a moment, we have the other boss I was referring to, who's very similar to Kaz. I think Kaz is harder, but I feel Lady Maria is better. She's a bit more intricate and has actually up to 3 phases going on in her fight that are all, you know, distinctly different. And she has everything that makes Bloodborne combat fun and enjoyable and encapsulates it all into this really neat package. Lady Maria is max aggression. She is just as agile as you, the hunter, and it's really fun playing against somebody that has the same properties and dynamic as you. She obviously gets more powerful through her blood magic throughout the fight, and there's extremely rewarding but tight parrying windows if you know what you're doing. It can make this fight a breeze if you understand the rhythm and properties of it. I don't get tired of it, man. I would play this fight every day of my life if I could. It's just a pain because you got to play through living failures in order to get here first, which, you know, honestly, I could do without. Let's move on over to Dark Souls 3 and talk about the Nameless King. Statistically speaking, it looks like the Nameless King is the most difficult boss in terms of completion rates. This doesn't include any of the DLC, but in base game DS3, the Nameless King has the lowest completion rate, and I think that's for a lot of reasons. It has technically 2 phases in which you fight the King of the Storm, where he's, you know, on his thing, and then this isn't the part that's a problem, though. I feel like Nameless King Phase 2 is not only excellently designed, but it is fairly difficult, and I think it's a ton of fun. In retrospect, Nameless King is by no means one of the hardest Souls boss ever, but at the time, and especially for the context of the game that it's in, it is certainly up there. I would say it's one of the more difficult bosses in Dark Souls 3. It's definitely build dependent to some extent, and it's also somewhat buffered by the fact that you have to do the Phase 1 over and over again in order to get here to the actual Nameless King, but he's no pushover whatsoever, and I think he actually has like some of the most fun I've ever had in a Dark Souls 3 boss playing against him. He's great. Now, let's talk about our final boss from Dark Souls 2. This is the last one we have on our list, and in my opinion, is the best boss in all of this game, including the base and DLC. I love the Fume Knight. I think he very much resembles Knight Artorias, and is all of the attributes and aspects that I love about that boss encounter, but takes it to the next level. Artorias is like a boss where you can prevent him from buffing and becoming more powerful. The Fume Knight will kind of just do whatever he wants, and you have to deal with it. The only thing I'm not in love with is there's this prerequisite where you need these like smelter shards to destroy these regenerating health pools around his arena. Otherwise, he can be an absolute nightmare to deal with. Once you destroy those, it becomes a very traditional, you know, sword fight, and I think just realistically speaking is one of the best designed and is some of the best that Dark Souls 2 has to offer. I don't make it a secret that I'm not in love with most of the bosses from this game, but a lot of them are fairly high tier, and I would say if there is going to be something that's god tier from Dark Souls 2, inarguably, I feel like the Fume Knight at least has to be a contender, and for me, he's one of my favorites. Getting to as well, our final boss from the Elden Ring list is going to be Radagon of the Golden Order. Now, keep in mind, again, he's not the hardest boss. I would say Melania and even Malekith and possibly even Godfrey are more difficult than Radagon, partly because this is a two-phase fight with Elden Beast, but they are very different. I love Radagon's design, however. This isn't a difficulty ranking. This is like an overall design and a worst to best. So I think Radagon is one of the best bosses in Elden Ring, inarguably, despite him not being necessarily the hardest. He still is no easy walk in the park or a pushover. Genuinely, the only minor gripe I have about Radagon's fight is I don't like the mechanic where he goes invisible and yet can still be starting up an attack, and you literally cannot see what he's doing. If that were not the case, if he just didn't go invisible but he still teleported, I would be totally fine with that. It's the only little complaint I have about it. Otherwise, it's a god tier boss to me. And then also closing out our list for Bloodborne as well, we have Ludwig the Accursed / the Holy Blade. Now, I'm not sure if I actually think that Ludwig is the best boss in all of Bloodborne. I think I still like Maria more and maybe even Kaz, but to say that Ludwig is not an absolutely unique, incredible, and fascinating boss would be a lie. He is basically the Malekith archetype, which again, you know I have a soft spot for, I really like, and this is kind of version 1 of his boss battle. It plays out just like Malekith, where he starts out in a more of a beast and primal form in his moveset and his style, and his pace complements that brilliantly. He's very difficult to approach, and he has moves that are, aggressive and quick, and they come out fast. He can jump from the ceiling and nearly one-shot you if you're not being careful, but once you get him to, around half health and he enters phase 2, the fight completely changes. He realizes that the Moonlight Greatsword was on his back this whole time, and he now starts utilizing it, and so from this point on, he starts fighting a lot more formal and chivalristic. He's even up on his 2 legs, and the fight is not at all what it was in phase 1. It becomes like a little bit more of a ranged battle. You kind of need to methodically approach him instead. The boss design, as far as his look goes in the arena he's in, is genuinely terrifying, and I just love everything about the atmosphere here. And mechanics aside, those are wonderful and nearly perfect too. Everything falls into place like a symphony to make this an unforgettable experience. I think the Bloodborne community really thinks Ludwig is maybe the best fight in the whole game, and I would possibly agree with that. I can definitely see that opinion, although again, I still do think I like Maria and Kaz just a little bit more, although it's again such a close battle between all of them. No matter what though, I do feel to some extent Ludwig has become the face of Bloodborne and really what this game represents and the things that make it unique and special. Such an amazingly crafted game, and I think it has some of the best bosses in gaming history flat out. It's too difficult to figure out where to place all of these goats, but we need to talk about Genichiro from Sekiro. Now, this is including every encounter you might fight him in, because you face him at the beginning of the game, in Ashina Castle, and at the very end. And so he has slight variations in each and every single encounter, maybe a couple different moves here and there, but largely it's the same boss, just in a different context. But regardless of which time you're fighting him, Genichiro is one of the best designed bosses ever. When we were speaking about Lady Butterfly a little bit earlier in the video, I said that was my moment in Sekiro when the game clicked for me when I was playing it for the first time. And I heard the sentiment from a lot of people that Genichiro was actually where the game clicked for them. Genichiro will probably be the boss that you fight right after Lady Butterfly, so that makes sense, and I can completely understand why that is the case, because I also feel he introduces more mechanics that are not present in Lady Butterfly. For example, in phase 2 of Genichiro, he starts utilizing lightning reversals. I've kind of talked about how I think they're a little cheaply introduced for the first time, but once you know exactly how to do this, it becomes extremely easy, and unironically, his phase 2 is so much easier than his first phases. It's insane. Genichiro, I feel, is the best learning tool in Sekiro for just learning the mechanics and also learning how to become the boss, because that is what this game specifically is fundamentally built on. You will get bullied by Genichiro your first couple of times playing him, that's pretty much for sure, but as you play it again and again, you'll start to improve and get better. You realize that you can completely stomp him out and run him over to where he can't really do anything to you at all. It feels very different getting a flawless Genichiro run versus any other traditional Dark Souls boss. It's a different experience, and being the boss in a real sense is a totally distinct feeling, and I absolutely love it. Genichiro's one of the best bosses in gaming ever created. Heading on back to Dark Souls 3, we have Lorien and Lothric near the end of the base game, and this is perhaps the greatest duo fight ever created in a Souls game. I think I'll die on that hill. I feel the rhythm and the flow of this boss fight is absolutely unmatched by anything else, and the moves make sense. They're extremely intuitive, and everything feels very challenging but fun and fair. And the gimmick slash, like, comeback mechanic is that Lothric can actually revive Lorien an indefinite amount of times until you deal enough damage to him. So it's all about positioning as well, where you want to end up kind of near the back of him in end lag windows to where you can punish the younger prince so that he does not revive his brother almost infinitely. I don't know what it is, they just got the flow and feel right about everything, and I love the way the animations and weapons look. Like, it's extremely intuitive to dodge and react to. Everything is brilliant, man. It's like music. It's perfect. I could go on for hours about why this fight specifically is absolutely god tier, and I wish there were a few more fights like this, even in more modern Souls games. There's not really an Elden Ring equivalent to this that I can point to and say, like, hey, they perfected this formula, because I feel like this kind of is the perfection of this formula, and I wouldn't even know how to improve this fight, to be honest. I've sit here and thought about it for a long time, and I cannot come up with a single thing that they could do in order to make this fight objectively, genuinely better. I can sit here and look at virtually any Souls boss, and me being the nitpicky internet armchair critic that I am, I can name a bunch of things that I would do differently or what I would change to make the fight better. But I'm stumped with this, and I think that's a great sign. Like, it's perfect the way it is. I would not change a goddamn thing about it. It's excellent. It has very close competition to what may be otherwise the best fight in all of the Dark Souls trilogy, and specifically Dark Souls 3. I think it's up to these two. If it's not the twin princes, it has to be the absolute lad, Mr. Berserk himself, Slave Knight Gale from Dark Souls 3. This is the final DLC boss in this game, and the last Dark Souls 3 boss on our list. I feel like this is the best for a variety of reasons, but more importantly, I think that they understood the basics of why Souls bosses work, and this is the amalgamation of all the lessons they learned from out their previous games. He's got the perfect blend of ranged and melee attacks, along with some mix-ups, some timing switches in later phases, and an escalation of tension that is extremely real. He has a giant health pool, so pretty much no matter what, you're not speeding through this fight with any kind of realistic build. And the way that everything ratchets up in tension as the fight gets nearer to the end actually makes you pretty nervous and can really incite some fear in you. I think Slave Knight Gale was probably the most fun I had in Dark Souls 3, period. Because I knew the journey was about to nearly come to an end, and I realized that this is where they understood how to do a finale. I get Gwyn is like a good final boss, and it makes sense why he's kind of weak and pathetic for the lore, but you want something that kind of sticks with you and leaves an impression. Slave Knight Gale left the biggest boss impression on me, and is kind of what I imagine when I think of Dark Souls 3. If it's not Soul of Cinder, I feel like Slave Knight Gale is the face of this game in some ways. His design when it comes to his look, weapon, and moveset evidently takes a lot of inspiration from Berserk, and it makes sense why it has the repeating crossbow in his moveset, even though I personally feel it's a little bit out of place for a game like this. It makes sense if they're drawing a lot of inspiration from all that, but man, I can't talk highly enough about this particular boss, and I really do see a lot of his design coming in for the influence in Elden Ring. You can look at a lot of the bosses and see that they were very clearly inspired from a lot of the lessons that he employed himself, and so I hope we see something as grand scale and epic for finale bosses just like him, because he's everything mechanically and visually, thematically that you want. Getting close to the end of our list here, we have yet another final boss, and this is the true last boss of the game, Isshin the Sword Saint from Sekiro. So what's so cool about him is that he is the perfect final boss if Slave Knight Gale is just maybe a little bit flawed. What Isshin manages to do is test every single skill and mechanic that you've learned through the game, including, sword fighting. You fight against every weapon type, swords, spears, guns, lightning reversals, you name it, literally all of it. In this battle, you cannot afford to hesitate at all. He even says that when you die to him, he says hesitation is defeat, which again just sounds like a cool thing that a samurai would say or whatever, but he's genuinely giving you tips on how to beat this boss. It's very meta. It's a little bit like fourth wall-ish, but it's so much fun still, and learning this fight took me a long time the first time around because it is a very steep learning curve. Once I got it down, it's very easy to repeat and do flawless from here on out. I think the second phase is actually the most difficult of his because third phase he starts using lightning reversals, and again, if you know how to kind of abuse that mechanic, you get rewarded extra proportionally for that to where a point that might be a little bit too far in your favor. I mean, I don't think either of us are complaining. I feel, you know, we'll take all the help we can get, but if we can get free damage and posture off lightning reversals, we'll take those all day. It really comes down to how much he spams the move, to be honest, but I'm getting a little bit off track. The point is, it's the most learnable boss, and it has the like biggest rewarding learning curve as well. It feels so satisfying to learn and finally overcome it for the first time. I would say it becomes far easier on repeat playthroughs because much of it is just developing the muscle memory and learning the deliberate response to each one of his moves because you have to react in a very specific way. And while I absolutely think Ishin the Sword Saint is perfect, there is one boss, and it's going to be the top of the list for me, the very best boss. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce the GOAT, the man himself, Al Father from Sekiro. So while this is technically not the last boss in the game, I think it is the greatest one. This whole video currently is 2 hours and 48 minutes long so far, and I could talk for that exact same length about just this boss specifically. I realized that this one was something special when I was coming home and just literally replaying this boss over and over again. Even after I had beat the game, there was something about the way that this, like the logic trees can go, and that the replayability of this fight is absolutely unmatched. If you're really good, you can kind of speed through Ishin if you really just shut him down. You can't necessarily do the same thing here. It's a bit harder to do so, but I just think that the variety of, you know, playthrough to playthrough of this is insane, and the way that you can strategize against Al, there's so many intricacies to this fight. Now, if you were paying attention earlier, you're like, hey, we fought Great Shinobi Al, why is there a big difference? Well, there isn't a huge difference, but I do feel as if Father is better. He's more in his prime in the game, and so he fights a bit more aggressively, doesn't use his like corny cheese tactics as much, and is a little bit just more, you know, straightforward on the ground, sword to sword kind of combat, and just like, I don't know, dude, it's sheer perfection. I believe Al Father is the greatest boss fight of any Souls game. From Demon Souls to Elden Ring, this is the peak of its design, execution, philosophy, and everything else. Now, we ranked a lot of Souls bosses today, but if for some reason I missed one or you think something else should have been on this list, please write it on a piece of paper and shove it up your... Anyways, no, I'm just kidding. Thank you guys so much for watching. This video took an unreal amount of time and work, and so if you made it this far, I just want to say, like, thank you beyond what I could say in words. Like, I really do appreciate it. I worked so unbelievably hard putting this together for you guys, and this video, from its conception and me fighting all of the bosses and then putting together all the footage to make this, took well over a year. So this has been a year's work of my life, and I really hope you guys got something out of it. Leave a like if you did, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and let me know what you thought below. But thank you all for watching once again, and I will catch you guys in the next one.